Hey, welcome back. Or maybe welcome for the very first time. Either way, I am really glad you're here tonight. Pull your blanket a little closer, settle into that pillow, and let yourself exhale. Because tonight, we're going somewhere you have never quite been before. Imagine waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Not because your alarm went off, not because your phone buzzed, but because if you did not wake up, the fire would go out. The bread would not rise. The water would not be heated, and 12 people would have nothing to eat by sunrise. Welcome to the 18th century, and welcome to the house that never, ever slept. Here is what almost no history book will tell you. Running a household in the 1700s was not a lifestyle. It was a full-time operation, more complex, more physical, and more relentless than most people running a small business today. And yet somehow it happened every single day, quietly, without credit, without rest. Stay with me tonight, because by the time we're done, you will never look at your kitchen sink the same way again. Before we dive in, if this kind of story speaks to you, if you love history, told the way it was actually lived, would you consider subscribing to the channel and dropping a like on this video? Not because I'm asking you to, but because if what I bring you tonight truly moves, truly makes you feel something. That little gesture means the world to me and helps this channel reach more people who need a quiet story to fall asleep to. And I would genuinely love to know, where are you watching this from tonight? Are you curled up in bed, or maybe on the couch with a cup of tea going cold on the table? Drop in the comments. I read every single one. Now dim the lights if you can. Let the room go soft around you, and let us step together through the front door of a house in the 18th century and find out what it truly took to keep it alive. Let us say it is a Tuesday morning sometime in the year 1742. This city is London. The house belongs to a merchant family, not the aristocracy, not the very poor, but that vast, complicated middle ground of people who were respectable, who had ambitions, who cared deeply about appearances, and who are quietly exhausted most of the time. The house has 4 floors. There's a drawing room, a dining room, a study for the husband, a nursery on the upper floor, a kitchen in the basement, and somewhere in between, tucked into the attic or behind narrow doors, the small airless rooms where the servants sleep. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, long before the family stirs, the house is already awake because someone has to light the fires. In the 18th century, fire was not a comfort. Fire was infrastructure. Without it, there was no warmth, no cooked food, no heated water, no way to do laundry, no way to iron clothes, no way to melt wax for candles, no way to bake bread. Every single morning, a maid, usually the youngest and most junior in the household, would crawl out of her narrow bed before dawn, often in a room so cold she could see her breath, and make her way down through the dark house, carrying a tinderbox. She would kneel in front of the fireplace in the kitchen first, because the kitchen fire was the heart of the whole operation. She would clear out the ash from the night before, which, if you have never done this, is not glamorous. It is gray and fine, and it gets into everything. Then she would lay the new fire paper first, then kindling, then coal, and she would strike the flint against steel again and again, coaxing a spark onto the char cloth, blowing gently, willing the thing to catch. On a cold, damp London morning, this could take 20 minutes, sometimes longer, and this was just the beginning. By the time the family came downstairs for breakfast sometime around 8 or 9 in the morning, dressed and composed and ready to face the day, the kitchen had already been burning for 4 hours. The cook had already been working. The kettle had already been boiled. The bread, if there was fresh bread, had already been shaped and set to prove. Everything the family experienced as a civilized morning had been constructed piece by piece in the dark. Now, here's something that genuinely surprised me when I first learned it. The 18th century household was not chaotic. It was not muddled or improvised or running on hope. It was in many ways extraordinarily organized. There were schedules, hierarchies, written accounts, and systems so detailed they would impress a modern operations manager. The mistress of the house, and we will spend much more time with her in the next part, kept what was called a household account book. Every candle, every pound of butter, every yard of linen, every tip paid to a delivery boy, written down in ink. Because in a world without grocery stores, without refrigeration, without running water, without any of the invisible systems that keep a modern home functioning. Nothing could be left to chance. Historians who have studied surviving household account books from this period describe them as almost breathtaking in their precision. One example from a prosperous English household in the 1760s records the exact cost of firewood by the bundle, the precise amount of flour used per week, the price of eggs on different days of the market, and the wages paid to each servant down to the penny. This was not obsessive tidiness. This was survival strategy. If you ran out of candles in January and had no record of when you last ordered them, you sat in the dark. If you did not track the flour, you ran short before market day. If you did not know what you were paying your cook versus what the household next door was paying theirs, you could lose her in an afternoon. The 18th century household ran on information the same way a business runs on data today. The difference is that nobody called it that. Let us talk about the rhythm of the day, because it was nothing like ours. In the 1700s, time moved differently inside a house. There was no electric light to extend the evening, so the day organized itself around the sun in a way we've almost completely forgotten. Summer and winter felt like entirely different worlds to live in. In winter, a London household might have only 8 hours of usable daylight. That meant everything. Sewing, reading, writing letters, teaching children their lessons, doing the fine work that required good vision had to be crammed into those few hours. After dark, you could work by candlelight, but candles were expensive, and using too many was a mark of either great wealth or poor management. Most households operated by a system of strict candlelight rationing. The family might have good wax candles in the drawing room. The servants had tallow made from rendered animal fat, which burned smokier, smellier, and dimmer. The kitchen worked by firelight whenever possible to save the tallow for the rooms above. And the maids, who stayed up late to finish their mending, they often shared a single candle between two of them, leaning in close, working quickly before it burned down. This is the detail that gets me every time. Two women bent over their sewing, sharing one small flame, and this was considered normal. The day itself had an almost musical structure to it. Mornings were for practical labor fires, cleaning, marketing, cooking, laundry on wash days. The middle of the day was when the family was most active: visits, errands, lessons, business. Afternoons began to slow. Tea, when it became fashionable later in the century, created a ritual pause that the whole household organized around. Evenings were for the family's social life, dinner conversation, perhaps a gathering, while downstairs the kitchen cleaned up after the meal. The dishes were washed in cold water. The floors were swept, and the fires were banked for the night. And then somewhere close to midnight, the house finally went quiet for about 4 hours until it all began again. What I want you to hold on to as we go through this series together is not just the facts, not just the account books and the tallow candles and the 4 in the morning fire lighting. What I want you to feel is the sheer unapologetic humanity of it. These were people who laughed and worried and loved each other and argued about money and got tired. Tired in ways we do not quite understand, because the tiredness of an 18th century household was bone deep and built into the very structure of the day. A study published by historians examining English household diaries from the 1700s found that the average domestic servant walked between 10 and 15 m per day, simply doing their work inside the house, carrying cold water, food, laundry, and messages between floors 10 to 15 miles inside one building. And the woman who managed all of them, who directed that labor, tracked every cost, made every decision, handled every crisis. She did not walk 10 miles. She ran the whole operation from her feet to her fingertips without a title, without a salary, and without anyone stopping to say, "This is extraordinary." This is what it meant to run a household in the 18th century. Not just keeping a home, running an enterprise, one with workers, budgets, supply chains, medical decisions, educational responsibilities, social obligations, and no days off. And we're only just getting started, because the woman holding those keys, the one with the account book and the household in her hands, she's waiting for us in the very next part. And I promise you her story is more fascinating, more powerful, and more quietly remarkable than anything you've imagined. So do not go anywhere. The night is still young, and there is so much more to discover together. There is a painting that has always stayed with me. It is not famous. It does not hang in the Louvre or the National Gallery. It is a small, quiet portrait from the mid-700s. A woman seated at a writing desk, pen in hand, a ring of keys hanging from her belt, a ledger open before her, and an expression on her face that is not quite a smile and not quite a frown, just focused, utterly, completely focused. And when I first saw it, my immediate thought was not how elegant or how historical. My thought was she looks like she is running a company, because she just was never allowed to call it that. In the 18th century, the woman who presided over a household, whether she had for servants or 14, held a role so complex, so demanding, and so carefully invisible that it has taken historians centuries to properly name it. She was called the mistress of the house, and the single most telling symbol of her authority was something so ordinary you might walk past it without a second thought. A set of keys, not decorative, not ceremonial, real heavy iron keys, one for the linen closet, one for the china cupboard, one for the tea chest, one for the wine cellar, one for the silver cabinet, one for the medicine stores. In a prosperous household, a mistress might carry 10 or 12 keys on her belt at all times, and every single lock they opened represented something that could not be accessed without her. Think about that for a moment. Tea was locked away because it was extraordinarily expensive in the 1720s. A pound of good quality black tea cost roughly the equivalent of a domestic servant's wages for a full week. Sugar was locked away. Spices were locked away. Wine was locked away. Even candles were sometimes locked away and distributed one by one. The mistress of the house was not simply a manager. She was the keeper of everything that kept the household alive. And losing those keys, misplacing them, letting them fall into the wrong hands was not an inconvenience. It was a crisis. Now I want to ask you something, and I genuinely mean this as a real question. Have you ever been in a situation where you are completely responsible for something? A project, an event, a group of people, and no one above you had any idea how much was riding on your decisions where you made 100 small calls every day. And if you got them right, everything ran smoothly and no one noticed. And if you got one wrong, the whole thing came apart. That was the daily reality of the 18th century housewife. And I use that word carefully, not as a diminishment, but as a description of someone doing work that was genuinely staggering in its scope. Let us talk about what she was actually responsible for, because the list is longer than most people realize. She managed the household budget, not a vague sense of it, but the precise tracking of every shilling coming in and going out in an era when cash flow was unpredictable, credit was personal and fragile, and one bad quarter could unravel a family's entire social standing. She hired, trained, and dismissed the servants, and this alone was an art form. We will explore that world in much more depth later in our series. But for now, consider that in a household with 5 or 6 staff, the mistress was effectively a human resources department, a conflict mediator, a trainer, and a labor court all rolled into one. She managed the food supply, not grocery shopping as we know it, but strategic purchasing, preservation, planning, and seasonal budgeting. What to buy at the autumn market, how much salt pork to lay in for winter, whether the household could afford fresh fish this week, or whether they needed to make do with dried. She oversaw the physical maintenance of the house linens, curtains, furniture repairs, the constant battle against damp and moths and mice and soot. She managed the social calendar, the dinners, the calls, the letters of invitation, and regret the careful navigation of who ranked above whom, and what that meant for seating arrangements. And she did all of this while also being expected to be a devoted mother, an attentive wife, a gracious hostess. And here's the part that really gets me to make it all look effortless. Because a well-run household was supposed to appear to simply be well-run, as though it happened by itself, as though no one was working particularly hard, as though the clean floors and the perfectly pressed linen and the impeccably timed dinner just materialized. The invisible labor of competence. There is a woman I want to tell you about. Her name was Elizabeth Shackleton, and she lived in Lancashire, England in the second half of the 18th century. She was not famous. She was not titled. She was a widow first of a textile merchant and later of a lawyer, and she ran her household with a level of precision and intelligence that had she been a man would almost certainly have made her a successful merchant or estate manager in her own right. We know about Elizabeth because she kept diaries, detailed, extraordinary diaries that have been studied by social historians as one of the richest windows into the reality of 18th century domestic life. And what those diaries reveal is not the soft, gentile picture of a lady of leisure. They reveal a woman who was constantly working. She recorded negotiations with tradespeople, disputes with servants, decisions about which fabrics to buy and at what price, calculations about whether to repair the kitchen ceiling or wait another season, medical decisions for her children and her staff, legal matters arising from her late husband's estate. On one particular day in the 1770s, her diary records that she resolved a dispute between two of her maids, wrote 4 letters on household business, reviewed the accounts with her housekeeper, visited a sick servant, oversaw the salting of a side of beef, and attended an afternoon call all before dinner one day. And she wrote about it in a tone that was almost casual, as though this was simply Tuesday, which, of course, it was what made this role so remarkable and so quietly powerful was the way it required a woman to hold 2 completely different versions of herself at once. In the front rooms of the house, she was grace itself, composed unhurried, delightful company, pouring tea with a steady hand, receiving guests with warm formality, conversing on topics of fashion, literature, and society with practiced ease. And at the same time, in her mind, always running in the background, was the list. The cook needed new instructions for Thursday's dinner because the butcher had not delivered the expected cut. The housemaid had been insolent to the cook, and something needed to be done before it became a real problem. The linen needed counting before it went to the heiress, because the last time 3 napkins had gone missing. The quarterly bills were due, and the grocer's account needed checking against her own records before she paid it. She sat in the drawing room, perfectly still, apparently absorbed in the conversation, and she was managing an enterprise in her head. I find that almost beautiful in an exhausting kind of way. Here is something that surprises people when they first encounter it. Many of these women were genuinely deeply educated in the practical arts of household management, not informally, not by accident, but through deliberate study. In the 18th century, there was a thriving genre of books specifically written for women running households. Hannah Glass published The Art of Cookery, Made Plain and Easy in 1747, and it became one of the best-selling books of the entire century, not just in England, but in the American colonies as well, where it went through multiple editions. But here is the thing about Hannah Glass's book that most people do not know. It was not just a cookbook. It was a manual of household economics. It included detailed guidance on calculating costs, stretching provisions, identifying when tradespeople were overcharging, how to preserve food safely, how to manage a kitchen budget across different seasons. She wrote with a directness and a practicality that was almost radical for the time, a woman writing for women, speaking plainly about money and management and the real, unglamorous work of keeping a house running. Another essential text was The Complete Housewife by Eliza Smith, published in 1727, which ran to 18 editions over the following decades. 18 editions in the 18th century. That is not a niche publication. That is a phenomenon. These books were read, annotated, argued with, passed between sisters and mothers and daughters, pressed into the hands of young women about to marry. They were taken seriously because the work they described was serious. And yet, and this is the tension at the heart of everything we are exploring tonight, all of this work existed in a strange legal and social shadow. Because in England, under the common law doctrine known as coverure, a married woman had almost no independent legal identity. She cannot own property in her own name. She cannot sign contracts. She cannot bring a lawsuit. She could not in most circumstances control the money she managed so carefully. Legally speaking, she and her husband were one person, and that person was him. So here is the extraordinary paradox. A woman might manage thousands of pounds worth of household resources over the course of a year. She might negotiate with tradespeople, make decisions that directly affected the family's financial well-being, extend, and collect informal credit within her social network, and run an operation of considerable complexity. And yet she owned none of it. Not the keys on her belt, not the ledger in her hand, not the house she ran so completely. Some historians have called this the most efficient unpaid labor arrangement in Western history. I think they have a point. But here's where I want to offer a different angle, because I think the story of the 18th century housewife gets misread sometimes in both directions. On one side, there is a tendency to romanticize it, to paint these women as serene, capable paragons, gliding through beautiful houses in beautiful gowns, managing everything with a smile. And on the other side, there is a tendency to present them only as victims, trapped and visible powerless. The truth, as it so often is more interesting than either of those pictures. These women exercised real power within the walls of their households. Their authority was genuine and substantial. A housekeeper who displeased her mistress was gone. A tradesperson who tried to cheat on the bill found themselves replaced. A servant who stole or who gossiped about the family's private affairs was dismissed without a character reference, which in the 18th century was effectively a professional death sentence. The mistress of the house made those calls quietly, definitively, without drama. And in the social sphere, in the management of relationships, alliances, and the informal networks of patronage and favor that held 18th century society together, women operated with a sophistication and effectiveness that formal history has consistently underestimated. There's a letter I want to share with you, not word for word, but the spirit of it, written by a woman in Bath, England, sometime in the 1780s. She was writing to her sister, who had just married and taken on her first household, and her advice was not about love or happiness or the joys of domesticity. It was practical, blunt, and almost funny in how modern it feels. She told her sister to always check the grocer's weights herself, because the scales were frequently dishonest. She told her to keep her own count of every item in the linen cupboard and never rely on a servant's word alone. Not out of distrust, she explained, but because people make mistakes and the loss is yours. She told her to review the accounts every single week without fail, because a month of small errors is a disaster, while a week of small errors is just a Tuesday. And she told her to never under any circumstances let anyone in the household see her uncertain. If you do not know, she wrote, take a moment, then decide. A mistress who hesitates loses more than time. I have thought about that line more times than I can count. A mistress who hesitates loses more than time. There is something in that sentence that reaches right across 300 years and lands with a quiet thud. These women, Elizabeth Shackleton and Hannah Glass, and the unnamed woman in Bath and thousands of others whose names we will never know, they built something every single day. They built order out of chaos, warmth, out of cold nourishment, out of raw materials and stability, out of a world that offered women almost none of it by law or by custom. They did it with intelligence and discipline and a quiet, iron-spined determination that the history books written mostly by men for most of history called simply keeping house, as if that phrase contained anything less than everything. And there is one more layer to this story that we have not touched yet, because managing the people and the money and the food and the linen was one thing, but managing the physical world of the house itself, the light, the heat, the fire, that was a whole separate battle. A battle fought every single day against cold and darkness with tools and resources and skills that we have almost completely forgotten. And that battle begins every morning before dawn with something as simple and as brutal as keeping a fire alive. That is exactly where we are headed next. Because the story of light and heat in the 18th century household is not just history. It is something that will make you pause the next time you reach for a light switch. And I think by the time we get through it together, you will find yourself feeling something you did not entirely expect. Come with me. You know that feeling when the power goes out. That first moment of total darkness, the hum of appliances gone, the glow of screens vanished. The house suddenly stripped of every invisible system you forgot was running. Most of us fumble for our phones within 30 seconds. We find a flashlight app. We check when the power will come back, and we treat the whole thing as a mild inconvenience that will be over before dinner gets cold. Now imagine that feeling. And then imagine it was not a temporary inconvenience. Imagine it was just Tuesday. Every Tuesday, and every Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and every single night of every year of your entire life. Welcome back to the 18th century. And tonight, we're going somewhere that most histories completely overlook. Not the grand rooms, not the candles flickering prettily at a dinner party. We're going into the cold corners of the house, into the economics of warmth, into the genuinely brutal calculation that ordinary families made every single winter just to survive the dark. Let me give you a number that stopped me cold the first time I encountered it. In London in the 1750s, a working-class family, a craftsman, say, or a shopkeeper, spent somewhere between a quarter and a third of their entire annual income on fuel and light. 1/3 on coal and candles, not food, not rent, not clothing, just the cost of not being cold and not being in complete darkness. When I first read that figure, I sat with it for a long time, because it means that warmth and light things we now treat as such basic, unremarkable utilities that we barely noticed the bill were for most 18th century families a genuine luxury. Something to be rationed, strategized over, and carefully managed. And the way different households manage that calculation reveals more about 18th century life than almost anything else you could study. Let us start with the candles, because the social hierarchy of light in the 1700s is one of the most quietly fascinating things I've come across in years of reading about this period. Now we touch briefly in our earlier exploration on the basic distinction between wax and tallow candles, but the story goes so much deeper than that. In the 18th century, there were essentially 3 different worlds of candlelight, and which one you lived in told the world exactly who you were. At the very top were beeswax candles, pure, clean, burning, slow, and expensive. They produced a steady bright flame with very little smoke and almost no smell. They were the candles of the aristocracy, and the very wealthy used in grand chandeliers, in silver candlesticks on dining tables, set for 20 in the private rooms of people who never once in their lives had to think about whether they could afford to light another one. In the 1740s, a pound of good beeswax candles cost approximately the same as a domestic servant's wages for 2 to 3 days. Not one candle, a pound of candles. Think about what that means for an average family of 6 trying to get through a January evening. Then came the middle ground, and this is where it gets interesting, because between the beeswax luxury and the tallow necessity, there is a range of options that the growing middle classes of the 18th century navigated with extraordinary creativity. Spermaceti candles appeared on the market from around the 1750s onward, made from the waxy substance found in the head cavities of sperm whales, which sounds alarming, but produced a candle that burned brighter and cleaner than tallow at a price that ambitious middle-class households could occasionally justify. These were aspirational candles, candles that said, "We are not the aristocracy, but we are not nobody either." There were also rushlights, perhaps the most ingenious and most poignant solution in the entire spectrum. A rushlight was exactly what it sounds like. A dried rush stem stripped of most of its outer layer, soaked in leftover kitchen grease, and allowed to harden. The resulting candle was thin, fragile, and burned for somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes. It produced a dim, wavering light barely enough to read by, really only useful for basic navigation around a room. But here's the thing, they were essentially free. Rushes grew wild in fields and ditches. Kitchen grease was a byproduct of cooking that every household produced, and a family that made their own rush lights spent hours of labor in exchange for hundreds of hours of light over the course of a winter. Gilbert White, the 18th century naturalist and writer, calculated that a single rush light cost less than a quarter of a farthing to produce, which in modern terms is essentially nothing. He described watching elderly women in his village spend their autumn evenings preparing rush lights for the coming winter months, working by the last light of dusk, to make the tools they would need once dusk came earlier. I find something quietly moving about that image, working in the last of the natural light to make the artificial light they would need when nature's light ran out. But candles were only half of the equation, because the other great enemy of the 18th century household, the one that threatened not just comfort but survival, was cold. And heating a house in the 1700s was in its own way just as complex and costly and socially revealing as lighting it. Here is something that almost never makes it into popular histories of this period. In Britain, the shift from wood to coal as the primary household fuel happened largely in the 17th century. Well before our story begins, and by the 1700s, coal was already the dominant fuel in London and most English cities. Which sounds like progress, and in some ways it was. Coal burned hotter and longer than wood. A good coal fire properly maintained could heat a room more effectively than almost any wood fire of comparable cost. But, and this is significant, but coal had problems that wood did not. It produced thick sulfurous smoke that blackened walls, damaged lungs, and turned the fog of 18th century London into something closer to a physical object than a weather condition. It required a specific kind of grate to burn properly, meaning households had to invest in iron equipment that itself cost money. It produced ash and clinker that had to be cleaned out regularly, which was dirty physical work, and it could not simply be gathered from a forest or a hedgerow. It had to be purchased, delivered by coal merchants whose weights and measures were notoriously difficult to verify, stored in a coal cellar, which was another thing a house needed to have, and paid for in advance before winter arrived, which meant that for a working-class or lower middle-class family, coal was a bill that landed in early autumn like a small disaster. Can I tell you about something called the coal factor? Because I think this detail, more than almost any other, captures the economic anxiety that sat at the center of 18th century domestic life. A coal factor was an agent, a middleman who sat between the coal producers in the north of England and the households in London who needed coal to survive the winter. And the system they operated was, to put it politely, not always designed with the customer's interests in mind. Coal was sold by the children, a unit of measurement that was not standardized across different parts of the country, which meant that a children in Newcastle was a genuinely different quantity than a children in London. Households who did not know this, who did, not track their deliveries carefully against their orders, paid for coal they never received. This was not occasional. This was systematic. Parliamentary inquiries in the mid-700s found widespread evidence of short measure in the London coal trade, with some estimates suggesting that ordinary consumers were regularly receiving 15 to 20% less coal than they were paying for. 15 to 20% in a budget where coal already consumed a quarter of the family income. That was not a small discrepancy. It was devastating. And this is why, coming back to our remarkable mistress of the house from the previous part of our story, one of the most important skills a household manager could possess was a thorough understanding of weights and measures, not as an academic exercise, as financial self-defense. Now, here's something I want you to sit with for a moment, because it speaks to a kind of resilience I find genuinely admirable. Despite all of this, the expense, the rationing, the short measures, the smoke, the cold, 18th century households developed an almost architectural approach to warmth. They did not heat their entire houses. They heated the rooms they were in. This sounds obvious, perhaps even simple, but the implications were profound. The design of 18th century furniture, clothing, and daily routine was shaped almost entirely around the reality of the single heated room. Wing-back chairs, those high-sided, enveloping armchairs that we now think of as purely aesthetic, were originally designed to shield the sitter from the cold drafts that inevitably circulated even in a room with a good fire. The wings caught the warmth and held it around the person sitting in the chair. They were personal heating systems built into the upholstery. Heavy curtains were hung not primarily for privacy, but for insulation to keep the heat that the fire produced from escaping through the thin, single glazed windows that most 18th century houses had. Bed hangings, the thick curtains that enclosed a four-roster bed on all sides, served the same function. You climbed into bed. You drew the curtains around you, and you created a small human-warm tent within a larger cold room. Bed warming pans, long-handled copper pans filled with hot coals or embers slid between the sheets before you got in, were not a luxury item. In a house where the bedroom temperature in January might be barely above freezing, a warm bed was the difference between comfortable sleep and a genuinely miserable night. And getting into a cold bed in the 18th century was not the mild discomfort of modern experience. It was climbing into something closer to refrigerated linen. Your body heat would eventually warm it, but the first minutes were, by all accounts in the diaries and letters of the period, a small ordeal in themselves. Something that tends to surprise people when they first learn about 18th century heating is the sheer amount of physical work involved in simply maintaining warmth. We've talked about lighting fires, but maintaining them was its own labor. A coal fire needed to be tended, regularly fed, raked, adjusted to keep it burning efficiently rather than smoldering wastefully. Coal that smoldered produced more smoke and less heat, which was both unhealthy and expensive. The ideal coal fire required a specific depth of coals, a specific draft through the grate, and regular attention throughout the day. In a household with multiple fireplaces in a prosperous house, might have 8 or 10, keeping every fire at the right level of burn throughout the day was essentially a full-time job for one person. Add to this the carrying. Coal was stored in the cellar. The fires were distributed throughout the house across multiple floors. Every bucket of coal that fed those fires was carried by hand upstairs across hallways, through the rooms of the house by servants whose backs and arms bore the quiet evidence of this labor every single day. Historians studying the physical records of 18th century working-class women have noted significantly higher rates of musculoskeletal stress injuries in the shoulders and spine compared to women of the same period who did not perform domestic service. The work of keeping a house warm left its mark on the body, often permanently. And then there was the smoke. Oh, the smoke. I want to spend a moment on this, because I think it is genuinely underappreciated as a feature of daily 18th century life. A cold fire in an 18th century grate, even a well-maintained one, produced significant quantities of smoke. Multiply that by the 10 fireplaces in a prosperous household by the thousands of households in a city like London or Edinburgh, and you begin to understand why contemporaries describe the air above these cities as permanently yellowish gray. Inside the house, the effects were less dramatic but more intimate. Walls were darkened, curtains were darkened, ceilings were darkened. The household accounts of prosperous families from this period include regular expenses for whitewashing walls and ceilings, not as decoration, but as a basic effort to maintain a livable environment against the constant deposit of soot. And the lungs of the people who lived in these houses, particularly the servants who spent the most time near the fires, were quietly, steadily damaged by decades of exposure to cold smoke. This was not understood medically at the time. The connection between smoke inhalation and respiratory illness would not be clearly established for another century or more. But the evidence is there in the historical record and the patterns of illness and early death that characterized the lives of domestic workers in 18th century cities. The warmth that kept the household functioning carried a cost that the people paying it could not even name. I think what moves me most about all of this, the candle rationing, the coal budgets, the wing back chairs, and the bed curtains and the rush lights soaking in kitchen grease, is not the hardship of it. It is the ingenuity, the constant creative, relentless human ingenuity of people who did not have the luxury of complaint. They could not turn up a thermostat. They could not order more light from a switch on the wall. Every degree of warmth, every hour of illumination was something they made themselves through labor, through planning, through an intimate daily negotiation with the physical world around them. And they built beautiful homes inside all of that difficulty. Homes that were warm enough and light enough and human enough to hold families and arguments and celebrations and grief and laughter. All the things that homes are actually for. We've spent this part of our evening with fire and light and coal, and the cold that waited just beyond the edge of every flame. And now I want to take you somewhere even more fundamental. Because if fire was the infrastructure of warmth and light, then the kitchen was the infrastructure of everything else. And what happened in the 18th century kitchen, the choices made, the labor performed, the constant war against spoilage and scarcity, and the unpredictable nature of food itself. That is a story that will genuinely change the way you think about what you eat and where it comes from. Come on, the kitchen is this way, and I promise it smells better than the coal cellar. Step into the kitchen for a moment. Not a modern kitchen, not the clean countertops and the refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, and the microwave waiting patiently beside the toaster. The kitchen I want to take you into tonight is underground, literally underground in most townhouses of the period. A semi-room with a low ceiling, a stone floor, small windows set at street level that let in thin bars of gray London light, and a heat so intense in summer that the cook who worked in it was by all accounts one of the most uncomfortable human beings in the entire city. The kitchen of an 18th century household was not a pleasant place. It was a workplace. Hot, loud, smoky, relentless, and at the same time the single most important room in the entire house. Because everything that the family experienced as civilization, every warm meal, every sweet pudding, every cup of tea, every dinner party that lasted 4 hours and left the guests feeling that the world was, after all, a rather fine place. All of it came from down here, from this room, from the hands of this cook. And the cook, I would argue, was one of the most skilled and most undervalued professionals of the entire century. Here's a question I genuinely want you to think about for a second. When was the last time you had to plan your meals a full week in advance? Not because you wanted to be organized, but because if you did not, you might genuinely run out of food. Not in a first world problems kind of way, not the mild inconvenience of an empty fridge at 11 at night, but in the true structural sense where what you could eat next Thursday was determined by decisions you made this Monday morning at the market. And there was no alternative plan, no delivery app, no corner shop open until midnight. That was the reality of feeding an 18th century household. And the person at the center of that reality was the cook. In a prosperous middle class or upper-ass household, the cook was the highest paid servant in the house, not the butler. Though the butler had more visible status and considerably more dignity in the formal hierarchy, the cook. And the reason was simple. A good cook was genuinely difficult to find, difficult to train, and almost impossible to replace on short notice. Historical records from 18th century London suggest that an experienced cook in a prosperous household earned between 8 and 12 per year in wages, a sum that, while modest by any modern measure, placed her meaningfully above a housemaid's 4 to 5 and reflected the genuine scarcity of her skill. She was, in the language of the time, an artisan, and her workplace, that hot, smoky basement kitchen, was her studio. The fireplace at the center of that studio was not like anything most of us have encountered. It was enormous, wide enough in many cases for a person to stand inside it, fitted with iron cranes and hooks and adjustable brackets that allowed pots and kettles to be raised and lowered over the fire to control temperature. Equipped with a spit for roasting, sometimes operated manually by a kitchen boy whose entire job for hours at a time was to turn the handle, and in more prosperous households, operated by a mechanical device called a smoke jack, which used the rising heat of the chimney itself to turn the spit automatically. The smoke jack is, now that I think about it, a genuinely elegant piece of engineering. A fan mounted in the chimney flue caught the rising hot air and converted it into rotational energy that turned the spit below. Renewable energy, 18th century style, powered by the same fire that was cooking the meat. I find it quietly impressive that people figured that out without a single engineering degree between them. But the spit and the smoke jack were for roasting, and roasting was the prestige cooking method. The one reserved for the best cuts of meat for dinner party centerpieces, for the kind of meal a household wanted its guests to see and admire. The everyday cooking of the 18th century happened in pots. Heavy iron pots hung over the fire or set on iron trivets beside it, filled with broths and stews and puddings, and the kind of slow, long-cooked food that could sit over a low fire for hours without ruining. And this is where the real genius of 18th century cooking reveals itself. Because without refrigeration, without any way to keep food cold, beyond the natural cool of stone cellar in winter, the entire logic of food preparation was oriented toward one thing: making it last. Let us talk about the icebox question, because I think people sometimes assume that 18th century households had no cold storage at all. That is not quite right. Some wealthy households had ice houses, underground chambers, often built into hills or gardens packed with ice harvested from frozen ponds in winter and insulated with straw. An ice house that was properly constructed and well stocked could keep ice usable well into summer, which sounds remarkable. but as a genuine historical fact documented in the records of country estates across England and France. The problem was that ice houses cost. Money to build required land to situate and demanded the annual labor of ice harvesting, which meant they were for practical purposes available only to the aristocracy and the very wealthy. For everyone else, cold storage meant the stone large shelf, the cool cellar, and the careful constant management of whatever food you had on hand. So, how did they actually keep food safe? The answer is a combination of methods that are simultaneously ingenious and by modern standards occasionally alarming. Salt was the cornerstone of everything. Salt preserved meat and fish through a process we now understand as osmosis, drawing moisture out of the food and creating an environment where the microorganisms responsible for decay struggled to survive. 18th century households that could afford it laid in large quantities of salt pork, salt beef, and salt fish at the beginning of winter, stored in wooden barrels or ceramic crocks to see the family through the months when fresh meat was scarce or expensive. The quality of this salted meat varied enormously. At its best, properly prepared salt beef from a reliable butcher was genuinely edible and nutritionally adequate. At its worst, which occurred more often than the historical record tends to acknowledge, it was tough, intensely salty, sometimes rancid in patches, and required hours of soaking in fresh water before cooking simply to make it palatable. And yet, people ate it because the alternative was going without. Beyond salt smoke was the second great preservative. Smoked hams, smoked fish, smoked sausages. The smoke deposited compounds on the surface of the food that inhibited bacterial growth while simultaneously drying the outer layers to create a barrier against further contamination. Most farmhouses and many town households had a chimney space or a purpose-built smokehouse where meat could be hung and slowly treated over days or weeks. The resulting products were not delicate. 18th century smoked ham was considerably saltier, drier, and more intensely flavored than anything you would find in a modern supermarket. But it would keep for months. And in a world where keeping food was the primary challenge, months of preservation was worth almost any sacrifice in texture. Then there was the art, and I use that word deliberately, of working with food that was no longer at its best. This is the part of 18th century cooking that food historians tend to handle carefully because it raises questions about what we now consider food safety standards. But I think it deserves honest attention because it tells us something real and important about the daily choices of people who simply could not afford to throw things away. Meat that had begun to turn was not automatically discarded. The outer surface might be trimmed away and the interior soaked in vinegar or rubbed with salt or submerged in a strong marinade. Strong spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg were used not only for flavor, but for their antimicrobial properties, which were understood empirically even if the microbiology was not. A cook who could take a piece of meat that had been in the ladder a day too long and turn it into something the family would eat without complaint was not cutting corners. She was demonstrating a professional skill that was genuinely valued. Hannah Glass's cookbook, which we mentioned earlier in our series, includes multiple recipes that are essentially rescue operations for food in this condition. Recipes designed to make the best of what you had rather than what you wished you had. That philosophy, waste nothing, manage everything, make every ingredient count, was not a trendy ethos. It was a survival strategy. Now, let us talk about the actual structure of meals because it was radically different from anything we would recognize today. In the 18th century, the main meal of the day was not dinner in the evening, as it is for most modern households. It was dinner in the early to mid-afternoon, typically around 2 or 3 in the afternoon for the middle classes, and sometimes as late as 4 or 5 for the aristocracy, whose schedule was governed entirely by their own preference. This meant that the morning was functionally the preparation period. The cook and her assistants worked from early morning, sometimes from 6 o'clock, sometimes earlier, preparing the dishes that would appear on the table around midday. Breakfast, by contrast, was a relatively simple affair. Bread and butter, perhaps some cold meat left from the previous day's dinner, tea or coffee, and little else. The idea of breakfast as a cooked elaborate meal came later, largely in the 19th century, with the Victorians who made a kind of performance art of the breakfast table. In the 18th century, breakfast was fuel, dinner was the event, and dinner in a prosperous household was genuinely theatrical. The service style of the 18th century, known today by the French term service à lise or French service, was nothing like the sequential courses we now expect at a formal meal. Instead, all the dishes of a given course were placed on the table, simultaneously arranged symmetrically, creating a visual tableau that was intended to be as impressive to look at as it was to eat. A dinner table set in the French style might have 8, 10, 12, or even more dishes arranged across it at once. Soups, fish, roasted meats, boiled vegetables, small pies, sauces, and relishes, all present at the same time, all requiring the diners to reach or ask for what they wanted. It was a display of abundance, a performance of prosperity, and for the cook, who had spent 8 hours producing it, watching it disappear in 90 minutes of conversation and appetite, it was, I imagine, both deeply satisfying and slightly exhausting. The cook rarely ate what the family ate, by the way. She ate the kitchen food, the simpler, plainer version of the household's provisions. The leftovers, the less attractive, cuts the bread that was a day old. The person most responsible for the quality of the meal was often the last person to benefit from it. Something worth pausing on because it connects to a larger truth about this period. The relationship between food and social class in the 18th century was not subtle. It was explicit, visible, and enforced through dozens of small daily mechanisms. The quality of meat you ate told the world who you were. Beef, particularly good cuts of beef roasted on a spit, was the prestige food of the English middle and upper classes in the 1700s. The English, in fact, had a notable reputation across Europe for their beef consumption, a fact that both flattered them and occasionally irritated the French. A household that regularly ate roast beef was signaling something. It was saying, "We can afford this. We are people of substance." The working poor, meanwhile, ate primarily bread, not as a side dish, as the meal. A working-class family in London in the 1750s might spend 60 to 70% of their food budget on bread alone, buying it daily, since they had no way to store it from the baker, whose quality and honesty varied enormously. The difference between the beef of the prosperous household and the bread of the laboring poor was not just a dietary distinction. It was, in the language of the time, a moral one. Contemporaries genuinely believed that eating better food made you a better person, more rational, more capable, more deserving of your position in society. I find this belief both historically fascinating and, to be honest, quite infuriating. But it was real. It was widespread, and it shaped the way food was thought about, written about, and distributed throughout the 18th century. One more thing before we leave the kitchen, and this is something I come back to often when I think about the ingenuity of people in this period. The 18th century was, in ways we rarely acknowledge, an era of extraordinary culinary creativity. Not despite the constraints of no refrigeration, no standardized measures, no reliable heat control, no food safety regulation, but partly because of them. When you cannot rely on perfect ingredients, you develop technique. When you cannot keep food cold, you develop preservation methods of remarkable sophistication. When you cannot control your oven temperature precisely, you learn to read heat through touch and sight and smell and instinct accumulated over years of practice. The cooks of the 18th century were not working with inferior tools compared to their circumstances. They were masters of their circumstances, and the food they produced, the great roasts and the slow braises, and the elaborate puddings and the carefully spiced preserves, was the product of minds and hands that were in their own domain genuinely extraordinary. We have spent this part of our journey in the kitchen, in the heat and the smoke, and the remarkable complexity of feeding a household before the modern world made it so effortless that we forgot it was ever hard. But there is another dimension of 18th century domestic life that touches on something even more fundamental than food. Something so basic that we have engineered it entirely out of our awareness. Water. Where it came from, how much labor it took to get it, and what happened to everything that left the household in the other direction. Because the story of water and waste in the 18th century house is not a comfortable one, but is a deeply human one. And it begins with a question that no one in the 18th century ever had to ask because the answer was always the same. The answer was, you go and fetch it yourself. Come with me. All right, before we go any further, I have to be honest with you about something. This next part of our story is not the prettiest. It is not the gleaming silver keys of the mistress of the house or the artistry of the cook with her smoked jack and her spiced preserves. What we're about to explore is the part that the beautiful paintings of the 18th century leave out entirely. The part that existed right behind the elegance underneath it really. And I think it matters not to shock you, not to make you feel superior to people who lived 3 centuries ago, but because understanding this particular dimension of 18th century life changes everything about how you understand everything else. It tells you why people moved the way they did through their days, why certain customs existed, why certain rooms were built where they were, and why, frankly, the development of the modern municipal water supply was not a minor improvement in urban infrastructure. It was one of the most significant public health achievements in human history. We just never really talk about it that way. Let us start with a single deceptively simple question. Where did the water come from? In the 21st century, that question barely registers. You turn a tap, water appears, and the entire chain of events that makes that possible. The reservoirs, the treatment plants, the pressure systems, the miles of underground pipe is invisible, silent, and essentially never thought about. In the 18th century, water was visible, audible. Even you could hear it being carried in London. By the mid-700s, there were actually water companies operating wooden and then lead pipes that brought water from the Thames and from local springs into parts of the city. But here's the thing that most people do not realize. These pipes did not deliver water continuously. They delivered water for a few hours on certain days of the week, typically 2 or 3 times per week to stand pipes or cisterns in the street or in better neighborhoods into a system in the house's basement. What that meant in practice was that every household in the city had to store the water it needed and make that stored water last until the next delivery day. A typical London household in the 1700s might have a lead-lined wooden cistern in the basement, holding somewhere between 100 and 200 gall. That sounds like a lot until you start calculating what a household of 10 people, family and servants combined, actually needed in a day. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, personal washing, scrubbing floors, watering the kitchen garden if there was one, supplying the horses if there were horses. Historians who have studied 18th century household water use estimate that even a fairly modest household required somewhere between 40 and 60 gall of water per day for basic functioning, which means a system that held 200 gave you at best 3 or 4 days of supply between delivery days. In a city where the delivery system broke down regularly, where pipes froze in winter, where drought reduced supply in summer, and where the quality of what came through the pipes was, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, variable. Variable is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Let me be more specific. The Thames, from which much of London's water was drawn in the 18th century, was not a clean river. It was the same river into which the city discharged its waste. Not metaphorically, literally, and directly. The connection between water supply and waterborne illness was not medically understood in the 18th century. That understanding would come only in the mid-9th century with the work of physician John Snow during the cholera outbreak of 1854. But even without the germ theory of disease, the people of the 1800s were not entirely without senses. They could smell the river. They could taste the water. And they developed a hierarchy of water sources that reflected, however imperfectly, a practical understanding that some water was safer than others. Spring water was prized and sold from carts in city streets. Water from known clean wells was preferred over river water. Rainwater collected from rooftops and stored in barrels was considered reasonably safe for certain uses. And the Thames water that came through the pipes was used for washing floors and laundry and other tasks where the risks were considered acceptable. Drinking water for households that could afford the alternatives was often something other than water, entirely small beer, which had been boiled in its production, or tea, which required boiling water to make, and was therefore inadvertently safer than drinking the untreated supply directly. This is one of those historical details that I find quietly extraordinary. The reason tea became so popular in 18th century Britain, the reason it went from an exotic luxury in the 1600s to a national institution by the 1700s is partly cultural, partly commercial, and partly in ways that nobody fully understood at the time, of a matter of public health. Boiling water to make tea killed pathogens. The British, in their enthusiasm for a cup of tea, were accidentally protecting themselves from waterborne disease. History is full of moments like this. Solutions that worked before anyone understood why they worked. Now for households that were not connected to any water supply at all. And this was still the situation for a significant portion of urban and nearly all rural populations in the 18th century. The daily reality was simply this. You carried it. Someone, usually a servant, a child, or the woman of the house herself in poorer households, walked to the nearest well-pumped stream or standpipe, filled whatever containers they had, and carried those containers back. Repeatedly. A wooden bucket filled with water weighs approximately 20 pounds when full. Carrying two of them, one in each hand, balanced on a yoke across the shoulders, meant carrying 40 pounds of water per trip over cobblestones, upstairs in all weather, multiple times a day. There is a reason that water carrying was considered heavy labor and not domestic light work. It was physically demanding in a way that modern life offers almost no equivalent for. And it was for the people at the bottom of the household hierarchy, one of the most relentless physical tasks of their day. Can I tell you about a woman named Mary Saxby? She was born in England in 1738, the daughter of laboring parents, and she spent much of her early working life in domestic service. She left behind a memoir, one of the rare first-person accounts of working-class life in the 18th century, and in it she describes, among many other things, the physical experience of domestic water work. The carrying of water for the wash, she wrote, was among the hardest labor she knew, not because any single trip was impossible, but because there was no end to it. The wash needed water for soaking water, for the first boil water, for rinsing water again, for the final rinse water, for cleaning the equipment when the wash was done. An entire wash day and wash day was a significant event in the 18th century household calendar, not a daily occurrence, but a periodic ordeal lasting a full day or more. Required quantities of water that had to be fetched, heated, used, and then disposed of. The disposing of it, by the way, was its own problem. You cannot simply pour used wash water down a drain. Most households did not have drains in any modern sense. You carried the dirty water out in the same buckets you had carried the clean water in. Which brings us gently, but inevitably, to the other side of this equation. Waste. And here I want to be as matter-of-fact as possible, because this is a subject that tends to make people either squeamish or facetious, and neither response really does justice to what it actually meant to manage human waste in a city of hundreds of thousands of people without a sewer system. In the 18th century, the standard solution to human waste in urban households was the chamber pot and the privy. The chamber pot, a ceramic or metal vessel kept in the bedroom or dressing room, was used during the night, and in weather or circumstances where going outside was impractical. It was emptied by servants every morning into a larger vessel called a slop bucket, which was then carried downstairs and out to the privy, or in some cases simply thrown into the street. That last option, throwing waste into the street, was technically illegal in most cities by the 18th century. It was also, based on the documentary evidence, extremely common. Edinburgh, in the early 18th century, was by multiple contemporary accounts one of the most dramatically malodorous cities in Europe. The city was built on a ridge with a deep ravine on either side, and its medieval tenement buildings rose to extraordinary heights, 6, 7, 8 stories, housing hundreds of people in vertical stacks with no adequate waste disposal system. The traditional evening practice in Edinburgh, which persisted well into the 18th century, was a cry from the upper. Windows before the contents of the chamber pots were emptied into the street below. The cry was gardily, a corruption of the French warning, garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. Anyone walking in the street below had approximately 1 second to take evasive action. This is either funny or horrifying, depending on how much time you've had to think about it. Having thought about it quite a lot, I have concluded that it is both. For households with access to a privy and outdoor pit toilet, typically in the backyard or garden, the situation was marginally more organized. Privies were emptied periodically by a category of workers known in England as night soil men. The name tells you everything you need to know about the hours they worked and the nature of their cargo. Night soil men came after dark partly for discretion, partly because the contents of the privy were technically a saleable commodity used as agricultural fertilizer, and the transactions were best conducted without too much public observation. They charged for their services, and the households that could not afford to have their privies emptied regularly simply had privies that were not emptied regularly. In a crowded urban neighborhood, the implications of this were serious. Waste seeped into soil, soil contaminated wells, well-supplied drinking water. The cycle was invisible to the people living inside it, but it was real, and it killed people in ways that would not be understood or interrupted for another century and more. Inside the house, the daily management of personal hygiene followed its own logic, one shaped entirely by the scarcity and labor cost of water. The modern concept of daily bathing, immersing the full body in hot water every single day, did not exist in the 18th century, even among the wealthy. This is often presented as evidence that people in the past were simply dirty. I think that framing misses the point entirely. People in the 18th century were clean in the ways they could be clean given the resources they had. They washed their hands and faces regularly, multiple times a day. In fact, they washed their feet. They changed their linen, the shirts and shifts and undergarments worn against the skin as frequently as their means allowed, because linen absorbing sweat and then being laundered was understood to be the primary mechanism of personal cleanliness. The concept was not that the body should be immersed in water daily. The concept was that clean linen touching clean skin was the definition of a clean person, which explains incidentally why linen, the white shirts of men, the shifts and caps of women, was so prominently displayed in 18th century portraits. It was not merely fashionable. It was a visible declaration of personal hygiene. Look at my clean linen. I'm a clean person. Full baths, immersion baths that happened in the 18th century, but they were events, not routines. They required filling a portable wooden or tin bathtub with water that had been heated over the fire, calculating how many buckets of water that required a bathtub holding somewhere between 20 and 40 gallons, and then multiplying by the weight of each bucket, and then adding the labor of heating every bucket over the kitchen fire. You begin to understand why a bath was planned in advance and shared. Yes, shared. Multiple family members bathing in the same water in sequence was entirely normal, and practically speaking, entirely rational. The water was not going to stay warm, and it was not going to be replaced. You went in order of social precedent, head of household first, and you made the most of it. I have genuinely never thought about the phrase the luck of the drawer in quite the same way since learning this. The person who filled the bath was of course not the person who took it, and the person who emptied it afterwards one bucket at a time, carried through the house and out the door, was also not the person who had enjoyed it. This asymmetry runs through the entire water economy of the 18th century household. The labor of water, fetching it, heating it, carrying it, using it, and disposing of it, was performed almost entirely by the people at the bottom of the household hierarchy. A senior housemaid in a prosperous establishment might carry water in quantities that modern exercise scientists would classify as serious physical training every single day without recognition, without extra pay for the physical demand of it, without so much as a comment from the family upstairs for whom the hot water in the wash basin simply appeared each morning as though by some quiet domestic magic. This, I think, is the heart of what I want you to carry away from this part of our story tonight. Not the details of the privies, or the night soil men, or the contaminated wells, though those details matter, and they are true. But this, the invisible labor, the work that happened in the early morning hours in the cold on the stairs, in the yard, in the kitchen, that made the comfortable civilized surface of 18th century domestic life possible. Every basin of warm water represented someone's labor. Every clean floor, every emptied chamber pot, every bucket of dirty wash water carried out through the back door into the gray morning air. All of it, someone's labor performed so completely out of sight that the people it served rarely had to think about it at all. And yet the people who performed that labor were not invisible to each other. They lived together, worked together, argued and laughed, and formed alliances and bore grudges together in the basement kitchens and the attic rooms and the back staircases of these houses. They had their own hierarchies, their own politics, their own codes of loyalty and betrayal. And managing all of that, not just the water and the coal and the candles, but the human beings who made the house run, was perhaps the most complex task of all. The servant world of the 18th century was its own society with its own rules, its own power structures, and its own extraordinary drama. That is exactly where we are headed next, because the story of who those people were, where they came from, what they wanted, what they feared, and what they were capable of is more human, more complicated, and more surprising than most history books have ever given them credit for. Stay with me. Picture this scene. It is a Wednesday afternoon in 1758. A woman, well-dressed, composed, carrying herself with a particular kind of careful confidence that mid-level class women in Georgian England had perfected, sits across a small table from another woman. The second woman is younger. She's wearing her best dress, which is not a very fine dress. She's holding a folded letter in both hands, and she's been holding it so tightly for the last half hour that the paper has started to soften at the edges. The older woman extends her hand. The letter changes hands. It is read in silence. The younger woman watches the older woman's face and tries to read something in it. Nothing shows. The letter is folded back, placed on the table, and in the next 60 seconds, a decision is made that will determine almost everything about the younger woman's life for the next several years. Where she sleeps, what she eats, how hard she works, whether she is safe, whether she's treated with basic decency, and whether she has any realistic chance of building a better future for herself. This is a job interview, 18th century style. And the letter she brought, that soft, careful document she's been clutching, is a character reference. The single most important piece of paper a domestic servant could own. Let us talk about the servant world of the 18th century, not as background color, not as a footnote to the lives of the families they served, but as what it actually was, a society within a society with its own rules and its own hierarchies and its own remarkable human drama. Because the domestic servant class of Georgian England and its European counterparts was vast, historians estimate that in London by the mid-18th century somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 8 of the entire urban population was employed in domestic service. 1 in 6. In a city of approximately 600,000 people. That is 100,000 human beings whose daily existence was organized entirely around the maintenance of other people's households. 100,000 people, each with a story, each with fears and ambitions and loyalties and grievances and small private joys. And the system that governed their working lives was in its own way as complex and as fascinating as anything happening in the drawing rooms above them. The character reference that letter the young woman brought to her interview as the foundation of the entire system. In the 18th century, a domestic servant moved from household to household over the course of a working life, and each move depended almost entirely on what the previous employer was willing to say about them. The reference was not a formality. It was a legal and economic instrument. A servant who left a position with a character, meaning with a written recommendation from their employer, could find another place relatively quickly. A servant who left without a character, dismissed in disgrace, or who left under circumstances their employer refused to endorse, faced a situation that was genuinely dire. No reputable household would hire someone who could not produce a character, which meant that the power of the mistress of the house to grant or withhold that reference was an almost absolute form of control. A servant who challenged the household's authority too directly, who was perceived as dishonest, who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when something went missing, regardless of actual guilt, could find their career effectively ended by the absence of a single letter. Think about what that means. Your entire professional future, your ability to house yourself, to feed yourself, to remain employed in the only trade you know, all of it dependent on the goodwill of one person who had near total power over your daily life. This is the context in which we have to understand the relationship between servants and their employers. Not as simple oppression, not as simple affection, but as something much more complicated, a relationship of genuine mutual dependency shaped by profound power imbalance and navigated daily with extraordinary care on both sides. Now, here's something that shifts the picture considerably, because while the employer held the power of the character reference, the servant held something too. Information, intimate, detailed, potentially devastating information. A servant who lived in a household knew things. They knew about the family's finances, who was behind on their bills, who had borrowed money from relatives, who had quietly sold the good silver and replaced it with plate. They knew about the family's health, who was taking what remedies, who had visited which doctor, who had symptoms that were carefully hidden from polite society. They knew about the family's relationships, the arguments behind closed doors, the letters that arrived and were read with shaking hands, the visitors who came and went at unusual hours. A servant who chose to talk, who gossiped to the neighbor's staff, who wrote to a relative in another city, who breathed a word in the wrong ear, could damage a family's reputation in ways that were slow, pervasive, and nearly impossible to repair. Georgian society ran on reputation, a family social standing their credit with tradespeople, their ability to make advantageous marriages for their children. All of this rested on what people believed about them, and the people who knew them most intimately were the servants. This is the unspoken tension at the heart of the 18th century household. The family needed the servants to know everything, and they needed the servants to say nothing. Let me tell you about something called the servants' tax, because I think it perfectly captures the social anxiety that the servant class produced in 18th century English society. In 1777, the British government introduced a tax on male servants, not on employing servants generally, specifically on male servants, footmen, valet, butlers, coachmen, male cooks. The tax was 1 guinea per male servant per year, roughly equivalent to a skilled worker's weekly wage, and it was paid by the employer. The official justification was revenue for the government. But the real social function of the tax was to make male servants a visible marker of wealth, a luxury that required formal acknowledgement and financial sacrifice. By the 1780s and 90s, the number of male servants a household kept had become one of the clearest public signals of that household's financial status. A family with 3 footmen was making a statement. A family with a butler, 2 footmen, a coachman, and a groom was making a very loud statement indeed. And the footmen themselves, those young men in their powdered wigs and their livery coats, standing at attention in entrance halls and behind dinner chairs, were essentially walking advertisements for their employer's prosperity. They were the human equivalent of a very expensive piece of furniture, and they knew it. How they felt about it is perhaps not difficult to guess. The internal hierarchy of the servant world was in its own right as elaborate and as strictly maintained as anything in the family's drawing room above. At the top of the male servant hierarchy sat the butler. He controlled the wine cellar, supervised the footmen, managed the silver-received tradespeople at the front door, and presided over the servants' hall with an authority that was within his domain, essentially absolute. A good butler was immensely valuable, paid accordingly, sometimes 15 to 20 per year in wages plus room and board, and treated by his employer with a degree of respect that acknowledged his indispensability. A bad butler was a catastrophe, someone who drank the wine he was supposed to guard, who accepted bribes from trades, people who allowed the footmen to become slovenly and undisciplined. The stories of dishonest butlers in 18th century literature are so numerous and so consistent that historians have concluded they reflect a real social anxiety rather than mere narrative convention. Below the butler came the footmen, typically young men chosen partly for their height, because taller footmen looked more impressive in livery. There are hiring records from this period that record the physical dimensions of footmen applicants with the same clinical precision that you might find in records for draft horses. 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet 5 feet 11 and a half inches. Being tall in this particular line of work was a genuine professional advantage. On the female side, the housekeeper occupied a position roughly equivalent to the butler's, but in some ways more complex. The housekeeper managed the female staff, held her own set of keys, controlled the household linens and stores, and served as the primary interface between the mistress of the house and the domestic operations below stairs. In a large household, the housekeeper was a figure of genuine authority and genuine dignity. She had her own sitting room. She ate apart from the junior servants. She was dressed as Mrs. regardless of whether she had ever been married, a courtesy title that acknowledged her status, and she could, in the daily operation of the household, wield considerable power over the lives of the people beneath her. Below the housekeeper came the lady's maid, a position of a quite different kind. The lady's maid attended personally to the mistress of the house. She dressed, her arranged, her hair, maintained her wardrobe, traveled with her, and was often the person the mistress spent more intimate daily time with than almost anyone else in her life. This proximity created a relationship of remarkable complexity. A skilled lady's maid who was discreet, reliable, and genuinely pleasant to be around was almost irreplaceable. She was also privy to more of her mistress's personal life than the mistress's own husband was in many cases. The diaries of Georgian women frequently mention their ladies' maids in terms that blend the professional and the personal in ways that are genuinely touching affection mixed with authority, intimacy mixed with the careful maintenance of social distance. It is one of the stranger relationships produced by the 18th century household. Two women, often spending hours a day together in the most intimate circumstances, who could not, by the rules of their world, be quite friends. Now I want to ask you something directly. If you had 100,000 people living in your city whose entire professional existence depended on maintaining the confidences of the families they served, whose housing, food, and income came from a single source that could cut them off with a letter, what do you think would happen? Do you think resentment would exist? Of course it would. Do you think theft would occur? Yes. Historical records from 18th century household accounts, court documents, and personal diaries consistently document what contemporaries called petty pilferage, the taking of small quantities of food, drink, candles, cloth, and other household goods by servant for their own use or for sale. This was not a rare occurrence. It was based on the evidence essentially universal. A certain level of taking was quietly understood by servants as an informal supplement to wages that were often genuinely insufficient, and by employers as a cost of doing business that was factored into household management. The line between what was understood to be acceptable in formal taking and what constituted genuine theft was drawn differently in different households. And defending that line, or choosing strategically when to enforce, it was one of the ongoing management challenges of the mistress of the house. When something significant went missing, a silver spoon, a bottle of wine, a length of expensive fabric, the response could be swift and serious. Servants accused of significant theft faced not just dismissal without a character, but criminal prosecution. In England in the 18th century, theft above a certain value was a capital offense. People were transported to penal colonies, first to the American colonies, later to Australia, for stealing household goods. The records of the Old Bailey London Central Criminal Court are full of such cases. Servants accused by their employers of theft, tried, publicly sentenced to transportation, or worse. Some of these servants were guilty, some almost certainly were not. The power to accuse was entirely on one side of the relationship. And yet, despite all of this, the power imbalance, the vulnerability, the legal exposure, the confinement, the servant world of the 18th century was not simply a world of misery and resentment. It was also a world of genuine community. The servants' hall, the room in a prosperous household where the staff ate together below stairs, was a social space in its own right. It had its own hierarchy, its own conversations, its own humor. Servants from different households visited each other in their limited free time. They formed friendships, romances, networks of mutual support. They shared information about good employers and difficult ones. In an era before any formal labor regulation, this informal intelligence network was the only protection a servant had against accepting a position in a household where conditions were genuinely bad. And many servants developed real lasting attachments to the families they worked for. Long-serving household staff appear in wills. They are mentioned in diaries with warmth and genuine grief when they died. There are letters, dozens of them, scattered through archives across England between former servants and their employers, families, maintained for years after a servant moved on or retired. The 18th century household, for all its power, symmetry, was also a genuinely human space. People lived together in it, depended on each other in it, and sometimes, not always, not cleanly, not without complication, cared for each other in it. There is one more dimension of this world that I want to sit with for a moment before we move on. Because running a household full of servants was not just a management challenge. It was an emotional one. The mistress of the house, who dismissed a long-serving maid for dishonesty, who did what her role required her to do, may well have gone to bed that night with something heavier than satisfaction in her chest. The servant who was dismissed, who left with or without that precious character reference, carried with her not just the practical consequences of her situation, but the memory of years spent in a place that had been whatever else it was her home. The 18th century household was not a corporation. It was a community of human beings, one with deeply unequal power, yes, one with legal structures that protected some and exposed others, yes, but a community nonetheless. And communities are always more complicated than the official story about them. We have spent this part of our evening in the world below stairs in the servants' hall, in the linen room, and the butler's pantry among the people who made everything else possible. And now I want to bring us upstairs, all the way upstairs to the linen closet. Because the laundry of the 18th century, the washing, the starching, the ironing, the counting, the storing was an operation so complex, so physically demanding, and so strategically important to the running of the household that it deserves its own chapter entirely. And I promise you, the story of wash day in the 1700s will make you look at your washing machine in a way you have never looked at it before with something very close to love. Something I want you to try just for a moment. Look down at whatever you're wearing right now. A shirt perhaps, a cotton top, something soft against your skin that you put on this morning without thinking that will go into a machine tonight or tomorrow and come out clean and ready again in less than 2 hours. Now hold that thought, and let me tell you what the same shirt or something very like it would have cost someone in the 18th century not to buy it, to clean it. Wash day in a Georgian household was not a day. It was an event. It was planned for, prepared for, and in some households actually dreaded in the way you might dread a significant ordeal. It upended the rhythm of the entire house. It consumed more physical labor, more water, more fuel, and more time than almost any other domestic task. And it happened in a prosperous middle-class household, roughly once every 4 to 6 weeks. Not every week, not twice a week, once a month, sometimes less. Which raises an obvious question. What did people wear in between? And the answer to that question opens up one of the most fascinating and least told stories of 18th century domestic life. The key to understanding 18th century laundry is understanding linen. Specifically, the role that white linen undergarments played in the whole system of personal cleanliness and social presentation. We touched on this briefly when we discussed hygiene, the idea that clean linen was the measure of a clean person. But the mechanics of how that worked are worth exploring properly because they explain so much about why the laundry was such a serious undertaking. In the 18th century, the clothes that touched the body directly, the shirts worn by men, the shifts worn by women, the caps, the neckcloths, the stockings were almost universally made of linen. Not just because linen was durable, because linen had a particular property that made it uniquely suited to its role. It absorbed. Linen absorbed sweatkin oils and the various deposits of daily physical life far more effectively than the wool outerwear worn over it, which meant that the woolen coat, the silk gown, the expensive outer garments that were difficult and costly to clean, they were in large part protected by the linen beneath. The outer clothes stayed clean because the inner clothes took everything, and then the inner clothes were washed regularly as often as the household could manage. This is the system. The linen was the sacrifice layer. The visible outer clothes were preserved by the invisible inner ones. And the entire logic of the 18th century wardrobe, the way clothes were designed, stored, maintained, and replaced flows from this fundamental arrangement. Now, a prosperous household needed a lot of linen to make this system work, because the whole point of having clean linen was being able to change it regularly. Ideally every day, or two for the family, somewhat less frequently for the servants. And that meant you needed enough linen in stock to bridge the gap between wash days. Historians studying probate inventories, the detailed lists of household possessions made when someone died, have found that prosperous 18th century families owned quantities of linen that seem almost staggering by modern standards. A well-appointed household might have 30 or 40 shirts for the master of the house. 30 or 40. Not because he needed 30 shirts, but because some would be in use, some would be airing, some would be at the laundress, some would be waiting to be ironed, and some needed to be held in reserve in case the laundry was delayed. The linen closet was not a storage space. It was inventory. It was capital. And the woman who managed it, who counted every piece in and every piece out, who noticed when something was wearing thin, who decided when an old sheet could be cut down into pillowcases or torn into rags for cleaning, was managing a genuine asset of the household. Linen was expensive. Good quality linen could last for decades if properly maintained, and an estate that was well supplied with linen was genuinely more comfortable, more presentable, and more economically secure than one that was not. Let me tell you about the actual mechanics of wash day, because I think the reality of it deserves more than a passing mention. The preparations began the day before. Linen was sorted, the most delicate pieces separated from the hardier ones, the most soiled items set aside for pre-treatment. Soaking was often started overnight, the pieces submerged in water to begin loosening the deposits of weeks of wear. On the morning of the wash itself, the kitchen was effectively commandeered. Every large pot in the house was pressed into service. Water was heated, enormous quantities of it, over the fire in a process that itself took hours before a single piece of cloth had been touched. The primary cleaning agent of the 18th century was not a bar of soap in the modern sense. It was lye, a strongly alkaline solution made by leaching water through wood ash. Lye was brutally effective at cutting through grease and organic matter. It was also brutally effective at cutting through skin. The women who did the washing, whether household servants or professional laundresses, worked with hands that were perpetually roughened, cracked, and re-ined from the repeated exposure to lye water. Soap, when it was used, and it was used for finer items, was made from tallow or vegetable oil combined with lye, and was considerably more expensive than the simple lye solution. Hannah Glass and other household management writers of the period include instructions for making soap at home, because purchasing it from a soap maker was a recurring expense that a careful housewife might prefer to reduce. The very fact that making your own soap was considered a reasonable option tells you something about the economics of the time after the boiling, and the scrubbing came rinsing, which required more water, more carrying, more heating. If the rinse water needed to be warm. And then came something that I find genuinely beautiful in its ingenuity, bleaching. Because white linen was only white if it was actually white, and the lye and the use and the time between washes had a tendency to leave linen with a yellowish dingy cast that no amount of washing entirely removed. The 18th century solution to this was sunlight. Wet linen was spread on grass, on lawns, on hedges, on clean meadows outside city centers, and left to lie in the sun for hours or days. The combination of moisture, oxygen, and ultraviolet light from the sun acted as a natural bleaching agent, gradually whitening the cloth back toward the pristine brightness that social presentation required. This practice, called grassing or cofting, required not just a suitable outdoor space, but suitable weather, which meant that in England, with its famously unreliable climate, bleaching was a genuine logistical challenge. Laundresses became expert readers of the sky. A clear morning that turned overcast by noon was not merely annoying. It was a professional setback. The linen would have to come and dry imperfectly, and the bleaching would have to be attempted again another day. And then there was one more bleaching method that is perhaps the most startlingly practical thing I've encountered in years of reading about this period: urine. Specifically, aged urine collected, stored, and applied to linen as a pre-treatment before washing. I want to be careful here about how I present this because it is easy to respond with simple revulsion and miss what it actually tells us. Aged urine contains ammonia, which is, as any modern cleaning product can tell you, a genuinely effective agent for cutting through grease and certain stains. People in the 18th century did not understand the chemistry, but they had learned empirically over generations that urine worked. Specifically on certain kinds of staining, the yellowing of linen at collars and cuffs, the grease marks that ordinary washing left behind. Households collected their own urine in designated vessels and in cities. There was a trade in urine from public establishments, which was purchased by lairesses who used it professionally. Fulling mills, which processed wool and cloth, also used urine in their operations for centuries. The practice was so common, so unremarkable that household management guides of the period mention it in the same matter-of-fact tone they use for everything else. It was not strange. It was simply effective. And effectiveness in the 18th century was never optional. Starching and ironing deserves its own moment, because it was a separate craft within the larger craft of the laundry. Linen that was washed and dried was not yet ready to wear. Shirts, caps, neckcloths, ruffles, any linen that needed to hold its shape and present a crisp polished surface had first to be starched. Starch was made from wheat or potato flour mixed with water, and the process of applying it correctly in the right concentration for the specific garment was a skill that took genuine practice to master. Too little starch, and the linen went limp within hours of wearing. Too much, and it went stiff as board and uncomfortable against the skin with the tendency to crack at the creases. After starching came ironing. The irons of the 18th century were solid metal heated by being placed directly in or beside the fire, then tested for temperature with a practiced touch of a dampened finger or a piece of scrap cloth. Too cool, and they left linen smooth but damp. Too hot, and they scorched. There was no dial, no indicator light, no thermostat. There was the judgment of a skilled hand developed over years. There is who ironed the fine muslin caps, and the intricate ruffled cuffs of a fashionable Georgian household was not performing a simple mechanical task. She was exercising a skill that was genuinely difficult to acquire and genuinely valuable once acquired. And a scorched cap, a ruined ruffle, was more than a laundry mishap. It was a professional failure. In households where expensive clothing represented months of income, it could also be a serious financial one. Now, let me ask you something because I am genuinely curious about this. If you had a guess before knowing anything about the history of professional laundry services, would you assume that 18th century households did all their own washing at home? Most people do. But the reality was considerably more varied and considerably more interesting. Professional laundresses, women who took in washing from multiple households and returned it clean, starched, and pressed were a significant part of the urban economy in 18th century England and across Europe. In London, Paris, Dublin, and Edinburgh neighborhoods near reliable water sources were often dominated by the laundry trade. These were working women, often married, often running what were essentially small businesses, managing multiple clients, maintaining schedules, subcontracting to other women when the volume was too great, and developing reputations for quality and reliability that were their primary professional currency. Theirs who was trusted with a household's finest linen was trusted with something genuinely valuable, and she was paid accordingly better than a domestic servant in many cases, because her skilled labor was compensated by the piece rather than by a flat annual wage. An experienced Londonress in the 1750s might earn between 1 and 2 shillings per dozen pieces processed, which when multiplied across a full week of clients, could amount to a genuinely respectable independent income. She was, in the language of the time, a tradesperson with all the pride and the self-determination that implied. There is something I keep coming back to when I think about the laundry of the 18th century, the sheer intimacy of it. The women who washed and ironed the household's linen handled the most private physical evidence of the family's daily life. The soiled shirts, the stained shifts, the napkins from the dinner party, the cloths from the nursery, the nightcaps from the sickbed. All of it passed through their hands. All of it was seen, assessed, treated, and returned. The laundresses knew things about the state of a household's health and daily life that no one else outside the family did. It was intimate knowledge, not spoken of, but unavoidable. And yet the women who held this knowledge were, in the formal social architecture of the time, essentially invisible. Tradespeople, working women, efficient and necessary, and almost entirely unacknowledged. What the linen closet represented in the end, beneath all the practicality and the economics, was something more than clean cloth. It represented the household's dignity, its public face, its claim to be the kind of people who had things in order. A household with a well-towed, well-maintained linen closet was a household that was functioning, that had the resources, the organization, and the skilled labor to present itself to the world with its best face forward, and a household where the linen was thin, yellowed, short in supply, imperfectly ironed. That was a household where things were quietly going wrong, where the money was not quite there, where something was slipping. In a society that read social standing in the finest of details, the state of your linen told people everything. We have followed the linen from the closet through the wash day and back again. And now I want to turn to something that ran underneath all of this, not as background, but as the engine that made every other decision possible, the money. Because the 18th century household ran on a budget that was far tighter, far more precarious, and far more cleverly managed than most people realize. And the woman who held the account book, who knew to the penny what the household had, what it owed, and what it could afford to pretend she was operating with a financial intelligence that deserves a great deal more credit than history has ever given it. That story is next, and it is more dramatic than you might expect. There is a particular kind of dread that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with a crash or a confrontation. It comes quietly. It settles into the chest on a Tuesday morning when you open a letter you already know the contents of before you've broken the seal. It is the dread of someone who has been managing very carefully for a very long time, and who is beginning to wonder how much longer the managing can hold. In the 18th century, this feeling had an address. It lived in respectable houses on respectable streets. It sat at well-laid tables. It wore clean linen, and it kept its face perfectly composed. We have talked about the household account book as a tool of management. We have talked about the mistress of the house as the person who tracked every cost and guarded every resource with something approaching professional discipline. But tonight I want to go deeper than the mechanics of the ledger. Because the financial life of an 18th century household was not just a matter of organization and efficiency. It was a performance, a daily, exhausting, high-stakes performance of prosperity, staged for an audience that included the neighbors, the tradespeople, the extended family, the acquaintances at church, the guests at dinner, and sometimes most painfully, the household itself. And understanding the gap between how 18th century households appeared financially and how they actually were financially is, I think, one of the most quietly devastating things you can learn about this period. Let me start with a concept that was absolutely central to the financial life of the Georgia middle classes. Credit. Not credit in the modern sense. Not a bank card or a loan with an interest rate and a repayment schedule. Credit in the 18th century was personal. It was social. It was in the most literal sense about whether people believed in you. The word itself, credit, comes from the Latin cred, meaning to believe or to trust. And in the 18th century, that etymology was still fully alive in how the concept worked. A household's credit with its tradespeople, the butcher, the baker, the grocer, the coal merchant, the draper, was built and maintained through the same mechanisms as its social reputation, through consistent payment, through visible prosperity, through the signals large and small that said, "This is a household that keeps its word." A household with good credit could purchase on account, buying today, and paying at the end of the quarter or at Christmas or whenever the arrangement stipulated. This was not unusual. This was in fact the standard way that most middle and upper class households operated. You did not pay for your groceries the day you received them. You ran a tab and settled it periodically, which sounds practical and civilized until you understand what happened when the settlement day arrived and the money was not quite there. Historians studying the financial records of middle-class Georgian households have found something that is simultaneously surprising and once you think about it, completely understandable. A significant proportion of these households that appeared by every external measure to be comfortable and well managed were operating in a state of chronic low-level debt. Not the catastrophic debt of bankruptcy, not the visible, humiliating debt of a family that had clearly fallen, but a quiet, persistent imbalance between what the household spent and what it actually had. A rolling deficit managed with skill and ingenuity that never quite resolved itself. The quarterly bills were paid, but sometimes only partially, with the remainder carried forward. The coal merchant was settled with, but the draper was asked to wait another month. The servants' wages were current, but the subscription to the lending library had quietly lapsed. The machine kept running, but it ran always a little closer to the edge than it looked. What drove these two things working against each other with a kind of elegant cruelty? The first was the genuine unpredictability of income in the 18th century. For the professional classes, lawyers, physicians, clergymen, merchants, military officers, income was rarely regular in the modern sense. It came in lumps and gaps. A lawyer might receive a large fee from one case and then wait weeks for the next. A merchant's returns depended on ships arriving, markets, behaving, foreign correspondents dealing honestly. A clergyman's income from his living might be supplemented by private pupils one year and not the next. Income was a river with an uncertain flow. Expenditure, however, was tied. The servants needed paying. The coal merchant needed settling. The baker called every morning. And the gap between an uncertain income and a certain relentless expenditure was where household debt was born. The second driver was something more psychological, and I find it genuinely fascinating in how modern it feels. In Georgian England, the middle classes lived in a state of acute social anxiety about their position, not because they were insecure people, but because the social ladder they stood on was genuinely slippery, and the consequences of falling even a little were genuinely serious. A family that visibly economized too aggressively risks something more damaging than mere embarrassment. They risk the withdrawal of the social invitations that maintain their place in respectable society. They risk the trades, people beginning to whisper. They risk the neighbors drawing conclusions. In a world where credit was personal and reputation was credit, looking like a household that was struggling financially could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If your butcher decided you were a credit risk, he stopped extending credit. If the credit stopped, you paid in cash for everything. If you paid in cash for everything, the reserves drained faster. And so families spent money they did not quite have on the perfectly rational grounds that appearing to have it was the precondition for eventually having it. The keeping up of appearances was not vanity. It was financial strategy, misguided sometimes, often ruinously so, but not irrational. Let me tell you about a man named Richard Campbell who wrote a guide called The London Tradesman in 1747, a remarkable survey of the economic life of the 18th century city that has since become an invaluable source for historians. In it he described what he called the middling sort of household, the families of professionals, tradespeople, and minor gentry who occupied the broad middle ground of Georgian society with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. He wrote about how these families hired servants they could not quite afford, because arriving to a dinner party without a footman in attendance was a statement no ambitious household wanted to make. He wrote about how they furnished their rooms with pieces beyond their means, because the drawing room was where reputations were formed and where the physical evidence of prosperity was most acutely read by visitors. He wrote about how they gave dinners that strained the household budget for a week in each direction, spending in advance, recovering afterward, because the social capital generated by a well-executed dinner party was considered a legitimate investment. Reading Campbell today, you could be forgiven for thinking he was writing about someone you know, or possibly about yourself. The anxiety has not changed that much. Only the specific objects of expenditure have. Now, within all of this, the rolling debt, the performance of prosperity, the gap between appearance and reality, there were women operating with a level of financial creativity that the period's formal structures gave them absolutely no credit for. We established earlier in our series that a married woman in 18th century England had no legal financial identity of her own. She could not own property, sign contracts, or control money in her own name. And yet the money that ran the household passed through her hands. Every shilling that went to the baker, the grocer, the coal merchant that was her negotiation, her decision, her management, and the strategies some of these women developed for stretching insufficient funds were frankly impressive. Keeping two sets of mental accounts, the official household budget that the husband saw and the real operational budget that she managed, was apparently not uncommon. Not from dishonesty, but from the practical reality that she understood the true costs of running the household in a way that a husband who never dealt with the tradespeople directly simply did not. Negotiating extended credit terms with tradespeople on the basis of personal relationships built over years, relationships the husband barely knew existed, was another tool. Substituting cheaper ingredients or materials in ways that maintained appearances without maintaining the full expense was a third. The Georgian housewife, who was managing a household on insufficient funds, was in every functional sense a financial manager, operating without authority, without recognition, and without the ability to formalize any of the arrangements she depended on. I want to tell you about a specific case that I find particularly illuminating. In 1768, a London merchant named Thomas Turner, who kept a remarkably detailed diary that has been published and studied by historians, recorded a series of entries about his household finances that paint an extraordinarily vivid picture of exactly this kind of pressure. Turner was a respectable man. He had a shop, a house, a wife, and social aspirations that were entirely normal for his position. And his diary records over months and years the constant, grinding negotiation between what his household needed to appear to be and what it could actually afford to be. He records arguments with his wife about expenditure, not because she was extravagant, but because the gap between what was expected of them socially and what their income supported was a source of genuine daily stress. He records the arrival of quarterly bills with a kind of low dread. He records decisions whether to replenish the wine cellar before the next dinner party, whether to authorize a new dress for his wife, whether to replace the kitchen equipment that was wearing out, with the careful, pained deliberation of someone who knew that every choice had consequences rippling forward into the next month and the one after. Turner's diary is not a story of poverty. He was not poor. He was something arguably harder. He was a man of middling means trying to live the life of a prosperous man, and the distance between those two things cost him and his household more than he could always comfortably bear. There is a moment in the diary literature of 18th century domestic life, not from Turner, but from a woman who kept her own household accounts in the 1780s, that has stayed with me since I first read it. She wrote in an entry with no particular drama to it that she had balanced the quarterly accounts and found that they were 12 shillings short. 12 shillings. Not a catastrophe, not a crisis, just 12 shillings that had somehow slipped through the careful net of her management. And then she wrote, "I have decided to let the candles in the back rooms run lower than usual for the next 3 weeks, and to substitute dried peas for the Tuesday meat twice before Christmas. This will restore the balance." No complaint, no despair, just a solution. Specific, practical, immediate. The kind of solution that only makes sense if you know your household's costs in enough detail to know exactly which lever to pull and by how much. I find that entry genuinely moving. Not for the hardship of it. 12 shillings is a small thing, but for the competence, the quiet, total, unwitnessed competence of someone who knew her household. The way a musician knows their instrument, every note, every string, every place where it might slip out of tune, and exactly what adjustment would bring it back. The financial life of the 18th century household was in the end a story about dignity under pressure, about the gap between how things looked and how things were, about the extraordinary human capacity to manage scarcity without surrendering the belief that things would eventually be all right. These are not rich people, and they were not poor people. They were people in the middle doing what people in the middle have always done, working harder than anyone above them acknowledged, worrying more than anyone below them guessed, and maintaining through sheer force of will and organizational intelligence the appearance of a household that had everything under control, even when, especially when everything was not quite under control. We have followed the money through the ledger and the quarterly bill and the careful 12-shilling recovery. And now I want to take you somewhere entirely different, away from the account books and into the pantry, the preserving pantry to be precise. Because the autumn kitchen of the 18th century, the one bubbling with jams and pickles and chutneys and bottled fruits and brewed small beer, is one of the most extraordinary and most underappreciated spaces in the entire history of domestic life. And the woman who presided over it was, whether she knew it or not, doing something that sits right at the intersection of chemistry, economics, and art. That story is waiting just ahead, and I promise it smells considerably better than the quarterly accounts. Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine the smell of strawberries. Not strawberries from a plastic container in a supermarket in January. Pale, cold, faintly disappointed versions of themselves. But real strawberries, summer strawberries picked at the peak of their warmth, still carrying the heat of a July afternoon in their skin. That smell. Now, imagine it is February. The ground outside is frozen. The windows are gray with cold. There's been no fresh fruit for 3 months, and there will be none for 3 more. And someone opens a jar. This is the story of the still room, and it is, I think, one of the most beautiful and most overlooked chapters in the entire history of the 18th century household. Not the grand drama of the kitchen with its roasting spits and its armies of pots. Not the political complexity of the servants' hall. Something quieter than either of those. A small room usually situated between the kitchen and the main house, smelling of beeswax and dried herbs and the ghost of last autumn's apple harvest. A room where one of the most important and most skilled forms of domestic labor took place. In a room that he in the houses of the middling and upper classes was presided over not by a servant, but by the mistress of the house herself. Because what happened in the still room was considered too valuable, too skilled, and too important to delegate entirely. The still room had a long history by the time of the 18th century. Its name came from the still, the distilling apparatus used in earlier centuries to produce medicines, perfumes, and spirits from herbs, flowers, and fruits. By the 1700s, the still was less commonly used in domestic settings, but the room retained its identity and its function. It was the household's laboratory, its pharmacy, its preservation workshop, the place where the fruits and herbs and flowers of summer were transformed through skill and patience, and a working knowledge of chemistry that no one called chemistry into the foods, medicines, and flavoring agents that would sustain and comfort the household through the long months when the garden offered nothing. Let me walk you through the preserving year, because it had a rhythm as distinct and as seasonal as any agricultural calendar. It began in most English households sometime in late spring. The first elderflowers of June were gathered early in the morning before the dew had fully dried, when the fragrance was at its most intense, and pressed in elderflower cordial or elderflower vinegar, both of which served as flavoring agents and as basic medicines for summer complaints. Then came the strawberries. Strawberry preserving was one of the great rituals of the early summer kitchen, and the recipes for it in period household books reveal an almost religious attention to detail. Mary Eales, confectioner to Queen and of Great Britain in the early 18th century, published a recipe collection in 1718 that became one of the standard references for household preserving. Her instructions for strawberry jam specify not just the ratio of fruit to sugar, but the exact stage of the boil, the way the preserve should sheet off a spoon when it is ready, the importance of skimming the surface carefully to achieve clarity. These are not vague guidelines. They are the instructions of a professional passing on hard-won knowledge. Because a jar of jam that fermented, that grew mold, that failed to set, that was not just a disappointment. It was a waste of sugar. And in the 18th century, sugar was expensive enough that wasting it in a failed preserve was a real and meaningful loss. Let us talk about sugar for a moment, because it sits at the center of so much of this story. In the early 18th century, sugar was still a relative luxury available, purchasable by the middling classes, but expensive enough to be treated with respect. By the mid-century, prices had begun to fall as production in the Caribbean colonies expanded, and sugar moved from luxury toward a staple of middle-class domestic life. But the moral dimensions of that price fall are something I want to acknowledge directly, because they are inseparable from the history. The sugar that sweetened 18th century preserves that filled the jars on the stillroom shelves that made the strawberry jam possible. The sugar was produced by enslaved people on plantations in the Caribbean. This is not a digression from our story. It is part of it. Every jar of jam, every bottle of preserved fruit, every batch of sugar-preserved ginger on those stillroom shelves existed in a supply chain that ran from the households of England all the way to the plantations of Barbados and Jamaica. Some English households in the late 18th century, as the abolitionist movement gained strength, actually organized boycott of Caribbean sugar, switching to honey, or simply doing without preserved sweets. These boycotts were not economically decisive, but they were morally deliberate, and the women who organized them were doing something that the period's formal political structures gave them no voice to do anywhere else. They were making political choices with their household budgets in the only arena where their decisions had direct power. Back to the stillroom calendar. After the strawberries came the gooseberries, the currants, red, white, and black, the cherries, the raspberries. Each had its season of perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, during which the household swung into preserving action. Quantities of fruit were purchased or gathered. Sugar was weighed out. The preserving pans, broad, shallow copper pans that conducted heat, evenly were brought out and set over the kitchen fire. And the work began. Jam making is at its core a race against time and chemistry. The fruit must cook long enough to break down its cellular structure and release its natural pectin, the substance that causes the preserve to set, but not so long that it loses its color, its fragrance, and the thing that makes it taste of summer rather than merely of sweetness. Finding that moment, the precise point where the preserver has cooked enough, but not too much, was a skill, not a recipe, a skill. And it was developed through years of practice, through the accumulated wisdom of mothers and grandmothers, through failure as much as through success. The 18th century woman who produced 30 jars of perfect strawberry jam in an afternoon was not following instructions. She was performing an expertise beyond jams and jellies. The still room produced a range of preserved goods that would surprise most modern kitchens. Pickles, vegetables, and fruits preserved in vinegar were produced in vast variety. Pickled walnuts, pickled mushrooms, pickled cucumbers, pickled red cabbage, pickled notorium seeds used as a substitute for capers. Hannah Glass's cookbook includes over 30 pickle recipes, ranging from the simple to the elaborate. Some of them require multiple days of preparation, salting, draining, soaking in spice vinegar, resealing with an attention to process that speaks to how seriously the results were taken. Pickles served a dual function. As a condiment, they brightened the somewhat monotonous flavor profile of winter meals. The salt beef and the stored root vegetables, and the dried pulses that dominated the colder months. And as a preservation method, they extended the usable life of vegetables that would otherwise be unavailable entirely in winter. The vinegar that preserved them was itself often made at home from cider or ale that had turned transformed by managed fermentation into an acid that was both a preservative and a flavoring agent. Waste nothing. Make something useful from what would otherwise be lost. The principle ran through everything. Now the brewing, because no account of the still room and its functions would be complete without the small beer. Small beer was a lightly fermented grain beverage very low in alcohol content, somewhere between 1 and 3%, that served as the standard daily drink of the 18th century household for everyone from the master of the house to the kitchen. Made, not because everyone in the 18th century was quietly inebriated at all hours of the day, though that is a persistent misconception, but because, as we touched on when discussing the water supply, small beer was safer to drink than the water. The brewing process involved boiling, which killed pathogens. The small amount of alcohol in the finished product provided additional protection. And unlike the Thames water that came through London's pipe, small beer tasted pleasant. A prosperous household might brew small beer every week, or 220 or 30 gallons at a time, stored in wooden casks in the cellar and drawn off as needed. The brewing was the responsibility of the mistress or the housekeeper, and it was taken seriously as a household skill. A household that ran out of small beer or that produced a bad batch sour flat or worse was a household with a problem, because people needed to drink something. And in the 18th century, small beer was what there was alongside the jams and pickles and small beer. The still room produced something else that I find quietly extraordinary. Cordials, concentrated fruit and herb syrups dissolved in sugar and sometimes preserved with a small quantity of brandy that were used as both flavoring and medicine. Elderflower cordial for its cooling properties in summer fever. Black currant rob, a thick, intensely concentrated syrup made from black currants boiled down with sugar used as a sore throat remedy throughout the winter. Cherry brandy, dams and gin. Quint wine, sloe gin made by infusing sloes in gin with sugar from the autumn harvest to be drunk at Christmas when the flavors had fully developed. These cordials and fruit wines blur the line between food medicine and pleasure in a way that is entirely characteristic of the 18th century still room. They were not divided into neat categories. A bottle of raspberry vinegar might be used on a salad at dinner, stirred into water as a refreshing drink on a hot day, or given to a child with a sore throat, depending on the situation and the household's needs. The stillroom woman, the mistress, or the senior servant who managed this space understood the full range of uses for what she produced. She was a generalist in the truest sense, and her knowledge was not abstract. It was embodied, stored in her hands as much as in her books. Can I ask you something that I have genuinely wondered about? When you think about the domestic labor of the 18th century, the fires and the water carrying and the laundry and the cooking and all the rest of it, does it feel remote? Does it feel like history? You can observe but not quite touch, because this is the place in the story where, for me at least, the distance collapses. The still room, more than almost any other space in the house, is the place I can feel most directly because the impulse behind it. The desire to capture summer in a jar, to hold something sweet and seasonal against the coming cold, to make sure that there is something good waiting on the shelf when everything outside is gray and bare. That impulse has not changed. Not in 300 years. Not in all the centuries before that. People have always done this. Made something that lasts from something that would not last. Turn the abundance of one season into the comfort of another. It is one of the oldest forms of hope there is. The rows of jars on the stillroom shelf told a story. A household that went into winter with a well-stocked still room. 30 jars of preserves, crocks of pickles, casks of small beer bottles, of cordial dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, was a household that had done its work, that had paid attention to the seasons, that had the resources, the knowledge, and the organizational discipline to turn the summer's abundance into winter security. And a household with an empty still room in November, one that had not preserved, not brewed, not laid up its provisions, was facing a harder winter, not just financially, emotionally, because there was something about the smell of a well-toed still room, the sweetness of the jam, the sharp, clean scent of the vinegar, the woody fragrance of the dried herbs that is fundamentally reassuring. It says we are ready. We have enough. Whatever comes next, we have enough. From a stillroom shelf with its preserves and cordials. And small beer, I want to take you somewhere you perhaps did not expect this story to lead. Because we've been talking in various ways about how the household sustained its adults, fed them, warmed them, cleaned them, managed their money, preserved their food. But there was another group of people in every 18th century household for whom the stakes of all this management were even higher. The children. Raising children in the 18th century, getting them through infancy, through childhood into adulthood, was an endeavor shadowed by a reality so different from our own that it requires a genuine act of imagination to fully understand. The nursery of the 18th century house was not simply a room. It was a frontier. And the story of what it meant to bring children safely through those early years is one that will stay with you long after this particular night is over. Come with me. Before we step into the nursery, I want to ask you something. How many people do you know personally who have lost a child? For most of us in the modern world, the answer is very few. Perhaps one, perhaps none. The loss of a child, which is real, and it happens, and it is devastating when it does, is thankfully a relatively rare experience in contemporary life. In wealthy countries today, fewer than one child in 200 dies before the age of 5. 1 in 200. Now hold that number, and let me give you a different one. In London in the 1700s, Historians estimate that somewhere between 40 and 50% of all children born in the city did not survive to their FTH birthday. Nearly 1 in 2, not in war, not in famine, in ordinary life, in ordinary households, on ordinary streets. This is the shadow that fell across every nursery in the 18th century. Not always spoken of directly, not always acknowledged in the formal social language of the time, but present, always present, in the careful way a mother watched a feverish child through the night, in the small clothes that were kept after a child was gone, folded carefully impossible to give away, in the diaries that record in the same measured handwriting used for grocery lists and household accounts. The loss of an infant in sentences so spare and so controlled that the restraint itself tells you everything. Understanding 18th century childhood, truly understanding it requires sitting with this reality before anything else, because it shapes everything. The way children were raised, the way they were loved, the decisions that were made about them, and the emotional landscape of every household that contained them. Let us start with the very beginning of life. Because the circumstances of infancy in the 18th century were dramatically different from anything we would recognize. In prosperous households, the kind of household we've been exploring throughout this series, a common practice in the early and mid-18th century was to send newborn babies to a wet nurse. Not because the mother could not feed the child, because it was considered in many social circles more fashionable and more convenient not to. A wet nurse was a woman typically of lower social class, often a recent mother herself, whose own infant had died or been weaned, who was paid to breastfeed the household baby in her own home, away from the main family. The baby would live with the wet nurse, sometimes for a year or more, and return to the family household once weaned. This practice has often been presented by later historians as evidence of maternal coldness of Georgian mothers who simply did not care about their children the way modern mothers do. I think that interpretation is both unfair and historically inaccurate. The reality was more complicated. Many mothers had genuinely little choice in the matter. Social pressure, the expectations of husbands and mothers-in-law, and a medical establishment that sometimes actively discouraged breastfeeding all pushed women toward wet nursing regardless of their own inclinations. And some women fought against it actively. The letters and diaries of the period include accounts of women who insisted on nursing their own children, who endured social disapproval to do so, who understood on some level, whatever the fashionable opinion, that proximity and care were what their babies needed. One of the great intellectual shifts of the second half of the 18th century was a turn against the wet nursing practice driven partly by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose enormously influential book on education published in 1762 argued passionately that mothers should nurse their own children. Rousseau's ideas were complicated. His personal life did not exactly reflect his parenting philosophy, to put it charitably. But on this particular point, his influence was real and significant. By the 1780s and 90s, maternal nursing has become fashionable in a way it had not been a generation earlier. The pendulum had swung, and in its swinging, it tells us something important about how child rearing in the 18th century was not a static tradition, but a genuinely evolving conversation. The nursery itself, that upper room with its small beds and its toys and its smell of warm milk and talc, was in a prosperous household, a world within a world, supervised by a nursemaid or a monthly nurse in infancy, and later by a governess. As the children grew, it operated on its own schedule, largely separate from the main household routine. The children ate in the nursery. They slept in the nursery. They played in the nursery. They saw their parents at prescribed times, typically for an hour or two in the late afternoon, when the children were brought downstairs dressed in their best to be presented to their parents and whatever company might be visiting. This arrangement, which strikes many modern readers as cold, even neglectful, needs to be understood in its own context. The separation was partly practical. A household with 4 or 5 young children could not function if the children were constantly underfoot in the rooms where the formal social life of the family took place. The nursery was where children could be children, noisy, messy, demanding without disrupting the performances of propriety that adult. Domestic life required. But it was also undeniably a form of delegation. The nursemaid who spent 16 hours a day with the children knew them in ways the parents with their prescribed visiting hours simply did not. She knew which child woke frightened at 2 o'clock in the morning. She knew the particular way a toddler preferred to be held when distressed. She knew who was susceptible to croup and who ran hot fevers at the first sign of a cold. Her knowledge of these children was intimate and daily and unreplaceable, and she was paid in a large household somewhere between £5 and £80 a year for it. Now I want to talk about illness, because in the 18th century childhood illness was not the manageable inconvenience it is for most of us today. It was a genuine, constant threat. The diseases that killed children in the 1700s, smallpox, scarlet, fever, whooping, cough, dysentery, measles, diphtheria, are either preventable by vaccination today, treatable with antibiotics, or both. In the 18th century, none of those options existed. Smallpox alone, a disease that has been completely eradicated from the world since 1980, killed an estimated 400,000 people per year across Europe in the 18th century and blinded or permanently disfigured many more. For children who had no previous exposure and therefore no acquired immunity, the fatality rate could be horrifying. In some epidemic years, smallpox killed a significant proportion of every child it infected. The fear of it was omnipresent, not abstract, immediate. Every parent in the 18th century knew families who had lost children to it. Many had lost children of their own. And then something remarkable happened. In 1721, a woman named Lady Mary Wortley Montague returned to England from Constantinople, where her husband had served as British ambassador. She had spent several years in the Ottoman Empire, and she had observed something that would change the history of medicine in Ottoman society. She'd seen the practice of variolation, a method of deliberately introducing material from a mild case of smallpox into a healthy person, producing a controlled infection that, if it went well, conferred immunity to the disease. The practice was common in parts of the Middle East, Africa, and China, where it had been used for generations. Lady Mary had herself been severely marked by smallpox as a young woman. Her brother had died of it. She had seen enough. She had her own son variolated in Constantinople before returning to England. And then she spent years against considerable resistance from the English medical establishment, which was skeptical of a practice introduced by a woman with no formal medical training advocating for its adoption in Britain. She was not a physician. She had no institutional authority. She was a woman arguing through her writing and her social networks for a medical intervention that most of the official medical world dismissed. And she was right. Variolation worked. It carried its own risks. A small percentage of those variolated developed serious illness, but it reduced the overall toll of smallpox significantly among those who received it. And the households that adopted it first were overwhelmingly the households of educated, informed women who had read about it, thought about it, and decided that the risk of the intervention was smaller than the risk of doing nothing. I find Lady Mary Wortley Montague one of the most remarkable figures of the entire 18th century. Not because she was unusual in being intelligent and well-read. There were many such women. But because she found in the narrow space available to her a way to act on what she knew, to use what she had observed and understood to protect people who would otherwise have been unprotected. That is not a small thing. The everyday medical management of children in the 18th century household was, however, considerably more ambiguous than the story of variolation, because the remedies available to parents and nursemaids for ordinary childhood illnesses range from the genuinely helpful to the actively harmful. Teething, this simple universal experience of a baby cutting its first teeth, was considered a medical crisis in the 18th century. These symptoms we now recognize as normal. Teething, discomfort, irritability, drooling, mild fever, disturbed sleep, were interpreted as dangerous and requiring treatment. And the treatments available were, to put it gently, concerning. Coral teething sticks, loops of polished coral mounted in silver, which babies were given to gnaw on, were benign enough, if expensive. But the preparations most commonly used for teething distress were not benign. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was administered to fretful infants in doses that would today be considered deeply alarming. Paregoric, another opium-based preparation, was sold specifically as a remedy for infants and children. These preparations worked in the most immediate sense. They sedated the distressed child. They also carry the risk of dependency, accidental overdose, and harm. The mothers and nursemaids who used them were not negligent. They were using the best tools available to them. The problem was that the best tools available were in some cases genuinely dangerous. This is the constant challenge of understanding 18th century childcare. The love and the intention were entirely real. The knowledge required to act effectively on that love was sometimes simply not there yet. The emotional dimension of raising children in the shadow of high infant mortality is something that historians have debated for decades. There is an older school of thought associated most famously with the historian Felipe Arias that argued people in pre-modern societies did not form strong emotional attachments to young children because the mortality rate made such attachment too costly. They did not love their children less in this argument, so much as they withheld love as a kind of emotional self-protection. I find this argument, the more I encounter the actual evidence, increasingly unconvincing. The diaries and letters of 18th century parents do not read like the documents of people who held their children at emotional arm's length. They read like the documents of people who loved their children completely and who were precisely because of that love devastated when they lost them. Hester Thrale, the writer and intellectual who was a close friend of Samuel Johnson and kept one of the most detailed family records of the 18th century, lost 4 of her 12 children in infancy or early childhood. Her records of those losses are not detached. They are raw. She wrote about the death of her infant daughter Penelope in terms of such unguarded grief that reading it across 2.5 centuries, you feel the weight of it directly. She loved that child. She grieved that child. And then she got up the next morning and managed her household and supervised her remaining children and wrote letters and kept accounts because that is what life required. The grief did not go away. It was managed. There is a difference. Education in the 18th century household deserves its own moment because the way children were taught in this period underwent one of its most significant philosophical shifts in the century's history. The dominant influence on educated middle and upper class thinking about childhood and education in the early 18th century was John Locke, whose essay on education published at the end of the 17th century proposed that children were born as blank slates, empty minds shaped entirely by experience. This was at the time a genuinely radical idea. It placed enormous responsibility on the household as an educational environment. If children were formed by what they experienced, then everything, the books they read, the language spoken around them, the habits they observed, the values demonstrated daily by the adults in their world, everything was education. The governess who taught the daughters of a prosperous family to read and write and do arithmetic was the formal face of this educational mission. But the informal education, the values absorbed, the behaviors modeled, the emotional patterns established that happened everywhere in the house all the time in ways no governess could fully control. The mistress of the house was not just running a domestic operation. She was shaping the next generation, and the weight of that responsibility in a household where Locke's ideas had taken root was considerable. The nursery of the 18th century was in the end a space of extraordinary contradiction. It contained both the deepest anxieties and the most intense hopes of the household. The fear of illness and loss, the fierce tenderness of parents who knew from personal experience or from watching others that the small life in the cradle was not guaranteed, the daily labor of the nursemaid who kept watch through the night, the philosophical ambitions of parents who wanted to raise children according to the best available thinking about human development, and underneath all of it, always the particular silence of a house that has lost a child, a silence that no amount of account book precision or household organization or careful management could fill. We have come a long way through this house tonight, through the fires in the kitchens, the linen closets and the still rooms, the servant halls and the nurseries. And now I want to take you to the room where perhaps more than anywhere else the human cost of all this management was felt most directly. Because when illness came to the adults of the 18th century household, when the mistress herself was sick or the master or a beloved servant, the The household did not call a hospital. There was no hospital to call. The house itself became the hospital, and the woman who had managed everything else was now also the nurse, the pharmacist, and in some cases the only thing standing between the person she loved and an outcome she could not bear to think about. That story is next, and it is one of the most quietly heroic chapters in this entire series. Somewhere in the middle of a January night in the 1700s, a woman wakes to find that her husband's breathing has changed. Not dramatically, not the kind of change that announces itself with noise and urgency, just a slight alteration in its rhythm, a new quality to it, something that was not there when she went to sleep. She gets up. She checks his forehead with the back of her hand. She lights a candle. She looks at his face in the small, wavering circle of light. And then she begins to think, not to panic, to think, because this woman is not just a wife. She is in this moment the first and only line of medical care available to the person she loves most in the world. And what she knows, what she has read, observed, practiced, stored in her memory across years of managing this household and these lives, is all there is. The household medicine chest of the 18th century was not a metaphor. It was a real object. A wooden box, typically fitted with compartments and locks, sitting in the mistress's bedroom, or the still room, or the housekeeper's room, containing the pharmaceutical supplies on which the household's health depended for everything short of a genuine medical emergency, was inside it. The contents varied by household, by region, by the mistress's reading, and her access to an apothecary, but certain items appeared with remarkable consistency across the documented medicine chest that have survived or been recorded. Bark, specifically Peruvian bark containing quinine, the active compound we now recognize as effective against malaria and certain fevers. This was one of the genuine medical victories of the 18th century. It worked. People who took Peruvian bark during a fever sometimes recovered in ways that were by the standards of the period almost miraculous. Rhubarb root used as a purgative for digestive complaints. Hartshorn, a preparation derived from deer antler used as restorative and as a treatment for fainting. Oil of cloves for toothache. Camphor for chest complaints. Laudanum. Yes, the opium preparation we encountered in the nursery used here for pain management in adults, as a sleep aid for the genuinely suffering, and as a general-purpose sedative for conditions that had no other. Treatment, blistering plasters. Which brings me to something I need to explain, because the medicine chest was only as good as the theory of medicine that guided its use. And the dominant theory of medicine in the 18th century was from a perspective of modern understanding almost entirely wrong. Not in every particular, but wrong in its foundations. The prevailing framework rooted in ancient Galenic medicine, and still largely intact, as the organizing principle of most 18th century medical practice, held that the body's health was maintained by the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was caused by imbalance. Treatment, therefore, was aimed at restoring balance. And the three principal tools for restoring balance were bloodletting, purging, and blistering. Bloodletting, the drawing of blood from a vein, typically in the arm, was performed on the theory that excess blood was causing the imbalance. Purging, the administration of violent laxatives to empty the digestive system, was used to remove excess humors from a body. Blistering, the application of caustic substances to the skin to raise fluid-filled blisters, which were then lanced, was intended to draw harmful substances out through the skin. None of these treatments had any genuine therapeutic effect on the underlying conditions they were meant to treat. In many cases, they actively worsen the patient's condition. Blood, letting in a patient already weakened by fever, remove the blood cells their immune system needed. Purging in a patient with a digestive illness accelerated the dehydration that was already threatening their life. Blistering added the risk of infection to whatever the patient was already fighting. The great tragedy of 18th century medicine is not that people were ignorant. It is that they were applying intelligence, training, and genuine care to a framework that was fundamentally mistaken, and patients died not from their diseases alone, but sometimes from their treatments. This is where the hierarchy of medical professionals matters, because in the 18th century the doctor was not a single unified category. There were three distinct tiers of medical practice, each with different training, different social status, and very different costs. At the top sat the physicians, men who had received a university education, typically at Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, or one of the great European universities, and who held a formal degree. A physician did not perform surgery. He examined the patient, diagnosed the condition, and prescribed treatment. He visited in a carriage. He wore a powdered wig. He charged accordingly. A single visit from a physician in London in the mid-1800s could cost half a guinea or more, roughly equivalent to a junior maid's weekly wage. For a working class or lower middle class household, calling the physician was a financial event, not a routine decision. Below the physician sat the surgeons, men whose training was practical rather than academic, who cut extracted set bones, dressed wounds, and performed the physical interventions that physicians considered beneath their dignity. Surgeons occupied an ambiguous social position, skilled, necessary, but not quite gentlemen. They had their own guild, the Company of Surgeons, and their own standards of practice. And at the broad base of the medical pyramid sat the apothecaries. The apothecaries were for most 18th century households the first and most frequent point of medical contact. They compounded and dispensed medicines. Yes, but in practice they also diagnosed, advised, and treated functioning for the families who could not afford a physician's fees as a general medical practitioner. And unlike the physician who was called to the house and paid per visit, the apothecary often extended credit. You ran a medical account with your apothecary the same way you ran a grocery account with your draper. Paid quarterly, settled when you could, which meant that the apothecary was not just a medical resource. He was for many families a financially entangled one. Now, here's where the mistress of the house steps back into the story with particular force, because the decision of when to call professional medical help and which level of the hierarchy to call was itself a significant household management judgment. It carried financial consequences. It carried social ones, too. A household that called the physician for every minor ailment was either very wealthy or very anxious, and neither was necessarily flattering. And it required a working knowledge of illness, of what symptoms were alarming, and what symptoms were simply unpleasant that a well-run household had to develop through experience and reading. In 1769, a Scottish physician named William Buchanan published a book called Domestic Medicine. It became one of the best-selling books of the entire century, not because it was aimed at physicians, but because it was aimed at households, specifically at women running households. Buchanan wrote in plain language. He described symptoms clearly. He explained which conditions could be managed at home and which required professional attention. He criticized the medical establishment's habit of secrecy, of keeping medical knowledge obscure so that patients remained dependent on expensive professional advice for everything. He was in his own way a radical, arguing that ordinary people, ordinary women specifically, were capable of understanding medicine well enough to make informed decisions about the health of their families. Domestic Medicine went through 19 editions over the following decades. It was read, annotated, argued with, and consulted in the middle of the night in households across Britain and its colonies. It was exactly the kind of book that appeared in the same shelf as Hannah Glass's cookbook and Eliza Smith's housekeeping guide, the literature of informed, practical, quietly empowered domestic management. Let me tell you about what nursing actually looked like in a sick room of the 1700s, because the labor of it has been almost entirely written out of history. When someone in the household fell seriously ill, a prolonged fever, a chest infection, an attack of gout bad enough to confine the sufferer to bed, the sick room became a significant operational demand on the household. The room needed to be kept at a specific temperature, not too hot, which was believed to worsen certain fevers, not too cold, which was understood to endanger the weakened patient. The fire in the sick room had to be managed, carefully maintained at a steady, moderate level, neither too high nor neglected. This alone, in an era of coal fires that required constant attention, was a continuous task. The patient needed to be fed. Invalids in the 18th century were typically fed broths, thin Giarel posy to warm drink, made from curdled milk with ale or wine and other easily digestible preparations. Making these was not difficult, but it had to be done regularly at the right temperature and quantities appropriate to what the patient could manage. The bedding needed changing. A sick person perspires. A feverish person perspires considerably. The linen we discussed in our earlier part of this series. The constant cycle of washing and ironing and storing took on an urgent immediate dimension in the sick room. Fresh linen against the skin of a feverish patient was not a nicety. It was part of the care. And through all of this, someone sat with the patient. Not always. Not continuously through every hour. But someone was responsible for checking, for listening, for being there when the condition changed in the night, and a decision had to be made immediately. In a household where the mistress took that responsibility herself, and the diary suggests that many did for their husbands and for their children, the physical and emotional toll was considerable. Sitting through a night beside a feverish child, monitoring the breathing, managing the temperature of the room, measuring out the prescribed medicines at the prescribed intervals, responding to every distress sound that is not passive, that is skilled, attentive, physically demanding work done without sleep, done sometimes for nights and weeks at a time, done with a particular quality of concentrated fear that anyone who has watched over a seriously ill person will recognize immediately. The moment when illness crossed into something worse, when the patient's condition deteriorated past what home nursing could manage, is one of the most poignant thresholds in 18th century domestic life. Because the household had to recognize that threshold, and responding to it correctly required both knowledge and the emotional steadiness to act on that knowledge under enormous pressure. There are accounts in the diaries of the period, accounts written after the fact in the way people write about things they need to process by writing that describe this moment with extraordinary vividness. The decision to send for the physician in the middle of the night. The wait for him to arrive. The examination conducted by candlelight. The prescription, which might be bloodletting, which might be a powerful medicine from the apothecary, which might be simply rest and time, and then the continued waiting. Because that is what illness ultimately demanded. Not heroic action, not a cure that arrived and resolved everything, but the steady, unglamorous endurance of uncertainty, the management of the household continuing around the sick room, the other children still needing their lessons, the cook still needing her instructions, the accounts still needing their weekly review, life insisting on continuing while part of the house was held in suspension. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever been the person in the household who manages when something goes wrong? Not the person who falls apart, though that is also a real and human response, but the person who quietly keeps things running, who makes the phone calls, handles the logistics, maintains some version of normally for the people around them, while privately carrying the weight of what is happening. If you have been that person, you know a particular kind of exhaustion that is not physical. It is the exhaustion of sustained vigilance, of being the one who is watching when everyone else has permission to be afraid. That exhaustion lived in the 18th century household. It lived in the woman who kept the account book and managed the cook and supervised the linen and decided when to call the physician and sat beside the bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, making sure the fire had not gone out. She did not have a name for what she was carrying, but she carried it, and when sometimes the illness did not resolve, when the patient, the husband, the child, the beloved servant who'd been in the household for 20 years did not recover, then the house faced its final domestic challenge of this kind. Death in the 18th century happened at home, not in a hospital, not in a clinical mediated space designed to distance the living from the dying. At home, in the room where the person had lived, surrounded by the people who knew them, and the management of death, the laying out of the body, the notification of family, the organization of mourning, the beginning of the long domestic process of grief fell to the household, to the woman who had managed everything else, who now managed this. There are no words for what that required of people. But I think after everything we have explored tonight about who these women were and what they carried, you already understand it. We have spent this part of our journey in the sick room, in the space where the household's resilience was tested most directly and where its limitations were felt most acutely. And now I want to bring us somewhere different to the end of the journey. Not to a sick room or an account book or a coal cellar, but to a question. The question that has been living quietly underneath everything we have talked about tonight. The real cost of all of this. Not in shillings and pence. Not in miles walked or buckets carried or fires lit before dawn. But the deeper cost. What it actually meant to be the person who held all of this together. Every day without rest. Without recognition. Without anyone stopping to say this is remarkable. What you are doing is remarkable. That reflection, that final honest reckoning with what running an 18th century household truly costs a human being is the last place our story goes tonight. And I think you will find that it lands closer to the present than you expect. We've traveled a long way tonight, through the dark corridors of a house that woke before dawn and never truly rested, through kitchens and coal cellars, linen closets and still rooms, sick rooms and nurseries, through account books written by candlelight and character references that could make or end a life, and jam jars sealed with hope against the coming winter. And now I want to sit with you here at the end of it and ask a question that I think deserves more than a passing answer. What do we do with all of this? Not academically, not as a matter of historical record, but humanly. What do we actually do with the knowledge of what it took, what it cost to keep a home alive in the 18th century? Let me start by telling you something that I think gets lost in most histories of domestic life. The work we have been describing, the fires and the food and the water and the wages and the medicines and the children and the grief was not considered significant by the world that surrounded it. Not officially, not publicly. In the 18th century, the great events of history were happening elsewhere. In parliaments and battlefields, in counting houses and coffee houses, in the salons where philosophers argued about the nature of liberty, and in the courts where kings and queens made decisions that would reshape the map of the world. The household was not where history happened. It was where history was sustained, where the people who made history were fed and clothed and kept alive and educated and nursed back to health when they fell ill, where the next generation of history makers was born and loved and raised into the world. The household was the infrastructure of civilization, and the people who ran it were officially doing nothing of consequence. I want to give you a number. In 1791, near the end of our century, the political philosopher and writer Mary Wollstonecraft published a work called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It is one of the most important texts of the entire 18th century. In it, she made an argument that was at the time considered by many people to be either radical or absurd. She argued that women were not naturally inferior to men in reason or capacity. She argued that the apparent weakness and incompetence of women was the direct result of their education and their social circumstances of being trained from childhood into dependence rather than capability. And she argued with a precision that is sometimes genuinely funny in its controlled fury that a society which wasted the intellectual and practical capacities of half its population was a society making itself less than it could be. Wollstonecraft was writing about education and political rights, but she was also, whether she fully knew it or not, writing about the households we have been exploring all night, about the women who ran them, about the gap between the complexity of what those women did and the social recognition they received for doing it, about the extraordinary human waste of genius going unacknowledged, because the room in which it operated had a kitchen door rather than a chamber door. Here's what I keep returning to. The women we have met across this series. The Elizabeth Shackletons, the Hester Thrales, the unnamed woman in Bath who taught her sister never to let the tradespeople see her. Uncertain the woman who balanced her accounts to 12 shillings and adjusted her candles and her peas and restored the balance. These were not ordinary people doing ordinary things. They were extraordinary people doing extraordinary things in conditions that would test the organizational capacity of anyone without the tools, the recognition, or the legal rights that would have made their work significantly easier. They managed complex human organizations. They made financial decisions with consequences measured in the stability of their family's entire social position. They practiced medicine with the knowledge available to them. They preserved food, brewed drink, administered medicines, negotiated credit, managed staff, educated children, maintained social networks, and absorbed the emotional weight of loss and uncertainty, without being given either the language or the space to set that weight down. And they did it every day without a day off, without a title, without a salary, without anyone in most cases ever stop and say what you're doing here is genuinely remarkable. Now I want to be careful here because there is a version of this story that tips into pure sentimentality that turns these women into saintly martyrs and the households they ran into scenes of noble suffering. That version is not true either. The 18th century household was not uniformly wonderful. It contained real inequalities, real hardship, real injustice toward servants, toward the poor, toward the enslaved people, whose labor made the sugar in the stillroom possible. The same woman who managed her household with admirable competence might have treated a servant with cruelty or refused to question the social structures that kept other women in far worse conditions than her own. History is not a morality tale with clean heroes and clear lessons. It is a record of human beings doing their best, and sometimes their worst in circumstances they did not entirely choose. Acknowledging the remarkable thing does not require pretending the complicated thing was not also true. Both were real. Both mattered. What has changed and what has not? This is the question that I think is worth sitting with for a few minutes before we say goodnight. What has genuinely changed since the 18th century in the story of what it takes to run a home? The physical labor has changed beyond recognition. The fire does not need to be lit before dawn. The water comes from the tap, heated by systems we never see and rarely think about. The food can be preserved in a refrigerator and purchased in any season. The laundry takes an hour, not a day. The medicine we have access to is compared to bloodletting and blistering plasters so effective as to be almost magical. These changes are real and they're enormous, and I think we should acknowledge them more often than we do. The next time your washing machine finishes a cycle, or you take a painkiller that actually works, or you drink tap water without any thought at all, there's a version of gratitude available in that moment that is richer than we usually allow ourselves to feel. Because someone lived the alternative, many millions of someones, and they did not have the option of gratitude for conveniences they had no way to imagine. But here's what has not changed. The work of running a home, even a modern home with all its conveniences, is still undervalued in exactly the way it was in the 18th century. We have different tools now, but we have not fundamentally changed our relationship to the labor of domestic life. We still tend to treat it as background, as something that happens so that other things can happen, as infrastructure rather than achievement. The person who keeps the household running, who tracks the budget and manages the schedules and handles the medical appointments, and keeps the pantry stocked and maintains the emotional temperature of the family. Through difficult periods, that person is still in most households doing work that is noticed primarily when it is not done. The 18th century household required someone to light the fire. The 21st century household requires someone to hold everything together. The fire is different. The holding together is not. There's a concept in economics called unpaid care work. It refers to all the labor performed within households and communities that has economic value that sustains life, enables productivity, and makes everything else possible. But that is not paid, not measured in gross domestic product, and not included in the official accounts of how wealth is created. In 2023, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, an international body that studies economics across its member countries, estimated the value of unpaid care work globally at somewhere between 10 and 39% of gross domestic product, depending on how it is measured. At the higher estimate, that is more than the manufacturing sector and the retail sector combined. More than manufacturing and retail combined, invisible in the official accounts done in most countries, primarily by women. The 18th century called this keeping house. We have more sophisticated language now. But the underlying reality that the work of sustaining life and family is vast, essential, and consistently under-acknowledged has not changed. I want to tell you about something that happened toward the end of the 18th century that I think is quietly significant. In 1796, a woman in rural England named, and Hughes kept a journal for about a year, a practical, unsentimental, closely observed record of daily life on a farm that she managed with her husband. Her journal was not written for publication. It was written for herself. In it, she recorded the weather, the state of the crops, the health of the animals, the management of the house, the doings of the people around her. She wrote about a successful day of butter making with the same attentive detail she gave to a difficult conversation with a difficult neighbor. She wrote about exhaustion without complaint and satisfaction without flourish. She wrote about her life as it actually was not, as she wished it were, not as she thought it should appear. And reading her journal today, what strikes you most is not the hardship. It is the fullness of it. The life that was being lived, the quality of attention that was being paid to ordinary things, the way she noticed, the way she cared, the way she made something coherent and sustained out of the raw material of days that asked a great deal of her and gave back what they gave back. Her journal was not discovered and published until the 1980s. For nearly 200 years, it sat in a collection somewhere unread, unknown, a woman's record of a year of living, waiting to be found. I think that is what this series has been in its own way. A small act of finding, of going back into the rooms that history usually passes through too quickly. The kitchen basement and the linen closet and the still room and the sick room. The places where the real work happened. Where real people, imperfect, exhausted, remarkable people built something every single day with their intelligence and their labor and their care, and called it with a modesty so complete it reads almost like self. Erasure, simply keeping house. If there is one thing I hope you carry away from this series, one thought that stays with you when the video ends and the night settles around you, let be this. The things that sustain daily life are not small things. The warmth in the room, the food on the table, the clean linen, the medicine measured out at the right hour, the accounts kept to the last penny so that 12 people can eat, and the household can hold together for one more quarter. These are not small things. They were not small things in the 18th century. They're not small things now. And the people who do them quietly, consistently, without requiring acknowledgement, deserve to be seen. Not occasionally, not just on the days when something goes wrong and you realize suddenly what has been holding everything together, but regularly in the ordinary light of an ordinary day. When the fire is lit and the water is warm and the house is running the way a house runs, when someone somewhere is paying attention, we've walked through the whole house. Now, from the kitchen fire at 4 o'clock in the morning to the still-room shelf in autumn, from the account book to the medicine chest, from the servants' hall to the nursery, from the beautiful heavy keys on the mistress's belt to the plain, careful entry in a journal that no one read for 200 years. I hope it has given you something. Not just information, not just history, but the particular feeling that comes from understanding, really understanding that the ordinary lives of ordinary people were never actually ordinary. That, running a household, any household in any century, is one of the most human things a human being can do. Full of difficulty and beauty and repetition and surprise. Full of love expressed in the most practical and unglamorous ways imaginable. Full of the particular kind of courage it takes to keep going every Tuesday, every wash day, every 4 in the morning when the fire needs lighting and there is no one else to do it. Thank you. I mean that simply and completely. Thank you for spending this time with me, for staying curious through the long hours of this story, for caring about people who lived 3 centuries ago in rooms we will never see. That kind of attention, the willingness to look at history not as backdrop, but as lived experience, is rarer than it should be, and it is genuinely what makes this work worth doing. If this series has moved you or taught you something you did not know, or made you look at your own home and the people in it with slightly different eyes, please consider sharing it with someone who would feel the same. And if you have a thought about something that surprised you, something you want to push back on, something that connected to your own experience of running a home or being part of one, drop it in the comments. I read them all, every single one, and I'm always grateful for the company. The next time we meet, I want to take you somewhere equally close and equally forgotten. Another world hiding in plain sight. Another set of rooms. Another set of lives. Another collection of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in circumstances that the official history barely noticed. The story is already waiting, and I think when we get there, you're going to want to stay a while. Until then, let the room stay warm, let the light stay soft, and rest well. You have earned it.